Welcome back to the channel. I'm really glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe you're listening late at night. Maybe you're winding down after a long day. Or maybe you're simply looking for a quiet story to drift off to. However you found this video, I'm happy you decided to spend this time with me. One thing I always enjoy seeing is where everyone is listening from. This channel has slowly grown into a small global community of night listeners, history lovers, and people who just enjoy a calm story before sleep. So before the story begins, I'd love it if you left a quick comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow, immersive historical storytelling like this, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories are released every evening, each one designed to help you relax, unwind, and drift into the past while you drift off to sleep. Tonight's story is the life of one of the most fascinating figures in world history. A man born on a small Mediterranean island who would rise to rule much of Europe. A commander whose victories reshaped nations, whose ambition redrew the map of a continent, and whose name would echo through history for centuries. Tonight, we follow the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the story begin. The island of Corsica lay in the blue waters of the Mediterranean, like a rugged stone fortress carved by wind and time. Mountains rose sharply from the sea, their slopes thick with forests of chestnut and pine. Villages clung to rocky ridges, and narrow paths twisted through valleys where shepherds had walked for centuries. The island had always lived in tension between independence and domination, claimed by foreign powers, yet fiercely defended by its people. It was a place where honor mattered deeply, where family loyalty could be stronger than law, and where memory of resistance passed from one generation to the next. Into this landscape, on August 15th, 1769, a child was born in the town of Ajaccio, who would one day shake the entire continent of Europe. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The timing of his birth seemed almost symbolic. Only months earlier, the island had finally fallen under the control of France. Corsica had long fought for independence, led by the nationalist hero Pasquale Paoli. But French forces had crushed the last resistance earlier that same year. The people of the island were now subjects of the French crown, whether they wished it or not. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, had once supported Paoli's resistance, but had eventually accepted French rule when it became clear that further fighting would bring only ruin. Like many ambitious men on Corsica, Carlo realized that cooperation with the new French authorities might provide opportunities his family could never have gained before. The Bonaparte family was not wealthy, but they belonged to the minor Corsican nobility. Their status mattered more in name than in fortune. They lived in a modest house in Ajaccio and struggled financially, yet their noble title opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed. Napoleon's mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a strong and disciplined woman whose personality would leave a deep mark on her children. She had endured hardship during Corsica's wars and possessed a toughness that Napoleon would later admire and emulate. She demanded obedience, resilience, and self-control. Sentimentality was rare in her household. Survival required strength. Napoleon grew up surrounded by siblings in a noisy, crowded home where resources were scarce and expectations were high. From an early age, he developed a fierce sense of determination and independence. Family stories told of a boy who preferred solitude, who wandered the hills around Ajaccio deep in thought, imagining battles and great achievements. Corsica itself shaped his identity. The island's culture was proud and defiant. Its people remembered every insult, every betrayal, every injustice committed by foreign rulers. Napoleon absorbed these feelings as a child, developing a complicated relationship with France that would follow him throughout his life. Though he would eventually rule France as emperor, in his earliest years, he felt more Corsican than French. Carlo Bonaparte recognized that the new political order offered possibilities for his sons. Through connections with the French administration, he secured scholarships that allowed Napoleon and his older brother Joseph to study in mainland France. For young Napoleon, leaving Corsica was both opportunity and shock. In 1779, at the age of 9, he arrived at the military academy of Brienne in northeastern France. The cold climate, the unfamiliar language, and the customs of French aristocratic society made him feel like a stranger in a foreign land. His accent immediately marked him as an outsider. Many of the other boys at the academy came from wealthy French noble families. They mocked his Corsican heritage, his modest background, and his imperfect French. Napoleon responded in the way he often would throughout his life, by withdrawing into himself and focusing intensely on achievement. Isolation became his companion. Instead of seeking popularity, he buried himself in study. Mathematics fascinated him. Military history absorbed his imagination. He devoured books about ancient commanders like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, seeing in their stories the possibility that a single determined individual could reshape the world. At Brienne, Napoleon also developed habits that would define his character: discipline, endurance, and a remarkable ability to concentrate for long periods. Winters in Brienne were harsh, and the school grounds often lay covered in snow. During one particularly heavy snowfall, the students organized mock battles using snow forts and projectiles. Napoleon quickly revealed a talent for strategy. He designed fortifications, directed attacks, and organized defenses with surprising skill for a child. These games were not merely play to him. They were experiments in command. Yet despite moments of success, he remained socially isolated. His Corsican background and serious demeanor kept him apart from many classmates. Letters he wrote during this period reveal a young man who felt misunderstood and determined to prove his worth. He once wrote bitterly about the arrogance of the French aristocracy, complaining that they judged him without understanding his homeland or his family. But beneath that resentment burned ambition. Napoleon understood that the military offered a path upward that few other professions could provide. In the rigid hierarchy of 18th century Europe, talent in war could sometimes break barriers that birth alone could not. After several years at Brienne, his academic performance earned him admission to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. Arriving in the capital exposed him to the grandeur of French society on a scale he had never seen before. Paris was enormous compared to Ajaccio. Its streets were crowded with merchants, nobles, soldiers, and beggars. Palaces stood beside narrow alleys. Wealth and poverty lived side by side. Napoleon spent little time enjoying the city. His family's finances had deteriorated further after his father's death in 1785, leaving him with heavy responsibility. He rushed through the academy's program, completing in 1 year what usually took 2. At only 16 years old, he graduated as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. Artillery was considered a technical branch of the army, requiring strong mathematical skill. For Napoleon, it was the perfect fit. Cannons were the science of warfare, calculations of range, trajectory, and timing. The young officer received his first assignment with an artillery regiment stationed in France. Yet his thoughts often drifted back to Corsica. The island remained politically turbulent. Nationalist movements still dreamed of independence. Napoleon returned there during leave periods and briefly involved himself in Corsican politics, hoping to help restore Paoli and free the island from French rule. For a time, he believed his destiny might lie in leading Corsica rather than France. But history had other plans. The world Napoleon entered as a young officer was already beginning to tremble. France itself was approaching a crisis that would destroy the old order and create opportunities unimaginable only a few years earlier. The French monarchy under King Louis XVI was drowning in debt. Years of war, including support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. Meanwhile, resentment against the aristocracy and the privileges of the nobility grew among the common people. By the late 1780s, the political system of France stood on the brink of collapse. Napoleon watched these developments closely. Though still a junior officer, he was deeply interested in political philosophy. He read Enlightenment writers who criticized monarchy and advocated reforms. Like many young men of his generation, he believed society should reward talent rather than birth alone. Yet his views were complex. He admired strong leadership and order as much as he valued merit and opportunity. When revolution finally erupted in 1789, it changed the course of his life forever. The storming of the Bastille and the wave of unrest across France shattered the authority of the old regime. Aristocratic officers fled the country in fear, leaving empty positions throughout the army. The revolution opened paths of advancement that had been tightly sealed under the monarchy. For ambitious officers like Napoleon, the upheaval created possibility. But the revolution also unleashed chaos. France soon faced threats both from internal rebellions and from foreign monarchies determined to crush the revolutionary government. War loomed across Europe. Napoleon, still a young artillery officer, trying to find his place in a rapidly transforming world, stood at the edge of events that would soon catapult him from obscurity into legend. The boy from Corsica, who had once built snow forts in the courtyard of Brienne, was about to discover that history itself had become a battlefield. And on that battlefield, he intended to rise. In the late 1780s, France stood quietly on the edge of a transformation so vast that few could fully comprehend it. The kingdom appeared powerful on the surface, ruled by centuries-old traditions and a monarchy that claimed authority from God. Yet beneath the polished halls of Versailles and the formal rituals of court life, the foundations of the nation were weakening. Debt strangled the government. harvest failures caused bread shortages. Ordinary people grew increasingly resentful of a system that taxed them heavily, while the nobility and clergy enjoyed privileges that seemed untouchable. The old order was beginning to crack. Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 20 years old, watched these developments from the position of a junior artillery officer. He was stationed with his regiment in Valence, a modest town along the Rhone River. His duties were routine: training with cannons, studying military manuals, and maintaining discipline among the soldiers under his command. To most observers, he was simply another young officer in the French army. Yet even during these quiet years, Napoleon was restless. He read constantly. Books filled his small quarters. Military treatises sat beside works of philosophy, history, and political theory. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar, analyzing their movements and decisions as if they were puzzles waiting to be solved. But he also read the political thinkers of the Enlightenment: Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, writers whose ideas challenged the traditional structure of power. Their arguments fascinated him. They spoke of nations governed by laws rather than kings, of merit replacing privilege, of the possibility that society could be rebuilt on reason and fairness. These ideas circulated widely among educated young men across France. For many officers in the army, especially those of modest birth, they represented hope. Napoleon was particularly drawn to the idea that talent should determine success rather than noble ancestry. His own life had already shown him the limitations of birth. Though technically a noble by Corsican standards, his family possessed little wealth and little influence within the French aristocracy. In the rigid hierarchy of the old regime, advancement often depended more on family name than on ability. But change was coming. In 1789, King Louis XVI summoned the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met in more than a century. The purpose was to address the kingdom's financial crisis, but the gathering quickly turned into something far more explosive. Representatives of the common people, known as the Third Estate, demanded political reform. When their calls were ignored, they declared themselves the National Assembly and began drafting a constitution. Events accelerated rapidly after that. Crowds in Paris stormed the Bastille prison in July, a dramatic act that symbolized the collapse of royal authority. Across the country, peasants revolted against feudal privileges and noble estates. The revolutionary movement spread like wildfire through cities and villages alike. Napoleon followed these developments with intense interest. At first, he saw the revolution as an opportunity for Corsica. If France was distracted by internal turmoil, perhaps the island could regain the independence it had lost 2 decades earlier. Napoleon returned home several times during these early revolutionary years and attempted to participate in Corsican politics. He admired the nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli, who had once fought for Corsican freedom against the French. Yet when Paoli returned from exile and resumed leadership on the island, the relationship between the two men quickly deteriorated. Paoli began to view Napoleon as too closely aligned with the French revolutionary government. Napoleon, in turn, believed Paoli was becoming increasingly hostile toward the revolution itself, the conflict grew personal and bitter. By 1793, tensions on Corsica reached a breaking point. Paoli's supporters forced the Bonaparte family to flee the island entirely. Their home in Ajaccio was destroyed, and Napoleon suddenly found himself permanently cut off from the land of his birth. Corsica, the place that had shaped his identity, was no longer his home. This exile forced him to fully commit his future to France. At that moment, the revolution itself was entering one of its most dangerous phases. European monarchies had become alarmed by the events in France and formed coalitions to restore the French king and crush the revolutionary government. War erupted along France's borders. At the same time, internal rebellions broke out across the country. Royalist uprisings threatened to overthrow the revolution from within, while political factions in Paris fought fiercely for control. In this chaos, opportunity appeared for ambitious young officers. Many experienced commanders had fled the country or been executed during the revolution's radical phase. The army suddenly needed leaders who were capable, loyal to the Republic, and willing to act decisively. Napoleon was exactly such a man. His chance arrived in the southern port city of Toulon. Toulon was one of France's most important naval bases. In 1793, Royalist forces there revolted against the revolutionary government and invited the British fleet to occupy the harbor. British warships sailed into the port, supported by Spanish and Neapolitan allies. The situation was disastrous for the French Republic. If Toulon remained in enemy hands, the Mediterranean fleet would be lost, and foreign armies would gain a powerful foothold inside France. The revolutionary government quickly assembled forces to retake the city. Among the officers assigned to the operation was a young artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, he was simply one officer among many. But Napoleon quickly noticed something others had overlooked. The harbor of Toulon was protected by a series of fortifications built on the surrounding hills. As long as the British controlled those heights, their fleet could remain safely anchored inside the port. If those positions were captured, however, the enemy ships would be forced to withdraw. Napoleon studied the terrain carefully, walking the ground himself, observing angles and distances. His mind worked through possibilities with the precision of an engineer. He proposed a plan. Rather than launching a direct assault on the city itself, the French army should concentrate its artillery on capturing the key fortifications that dominated the harbor. Once those positions were secured, cannon fire would make the port impossible for the British fleet to hold. The idea was simple, yet brilliant. Senior officers eventually approved the plan, and Napoleon was given responsibility for organizing the artillery attack. The young Corsican officer worked tirelessly. Cannons were dragged across rough terrain and positioned carefully along the hills overlooking the harbor. Batteries were constructed, ammunition prepared, and firing angles calculated with meticulous attention. Napoleon personally supervised the placement of many guns, ensuring they could deliver maximum effect. The assault began in December 1793. French troops launched coordinated attacks against the enemy fortifications, while artillery pounded defensive positions. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, But Napoleon's strategy gradually forced the Allied forces into retreat. Once the key heights were captured, French cannons began firing directly into the harbor. The British fleet suddenly faced a dangerous reality. Remaining in Toulon meant risking destruction. Within days, the enemy ships began withdrawing from the port. The Royalist defenders were abandoned, and the city soon fell back under control of the French Republic. The victory electrified the revolutionary government. Toulon had been saved, and at the center of that success stood a young artillery officer whose tactical insight had turned the tide. Napoleon Bonaparte was only 24 years old. His reward came quickly. The government promoted him to the rank of brigadier general, an extraordinary leap for someone so young. Overnight, he became one of the youngest generals in the French army. For Napoleon, Toulon was more than a victory. It was proof that his abilities could command attention. The years of study, the isolation at military school, the long hours analyzing battles, all of it had prepared him for this moment. He had seen a problem others missed, and he had solved it. Yet the revolution was far from stable. In Paris, political violence reached terrifying levels during the period known as the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary leaders executed thousands of suspected enemies in the Republic, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Napoleon navigated this dangerous political environment cautiously. He understood that success in revolutionary France required not only military talent, but also careful alliances. The wrong association could mean imprisonment or death. For a brief period, he himself fell under suspicion when political factions shifted, but his reputation as a capable officer eventually protected him. Still, these years taught Napoleon an important lesson. Power was fragile. Governments could rise and fall rapidly in times of revolution. Stability required strength, discipline, and decisive leadership. Ideas that would shape his future rule were already forming. By the mid-1790s, France continued fighting wars against multiple European coalitions, determined to contain the revolution. The Republic needed bold commanders who could defend its borders and defeat foreign armies. Napoleon Bonaparte had already proven that he possessed unusual skill. Soon, he would be given an army of his own. And when that moment arrived, the young general from Corsica would begin a campaign that would astonish Europe and transform him from a promising officer into a legend. The Italian mountains were waiting, and in those mountains, Napoleon would discover the full power of his ambition. The winter winds coming off the Mediterranean carried the sharp smell of salt, smoke, and gunpowder across the hills surrounding the port of Toulon. In late 1793, the city had become one of the most important battlegrounds in revolutionary France. What had begun as a political uprising had transformed into a dangerous military crisis, one that threatened the survival of the young French Republic. Toulon was not simply another city. It was the principal naval base of France in the Mediterranean, a harbor deep and protected, surrounded by rugged hills and fortified positions built carefully over decades. Whoever controlled Toulon possessed the ability to dominate the surrounding sea. When royalists inside the city rebelled against the revolutionary government, they made a decision that stunned Paris. Rather than defend the port themselves, they invited the enemies of France to occupy it. British warships sailed into the harbor, joined by Spanish and Neapolitan fleets. Foreign soldiers landed on French soil and quickly strengthened the city's defenses. Together with the royalist rebels, they transformed Toulon into a fortress. For the revolutionary government, the situation was intolerable. Losing Toulon meant losing control of the Mediterranean fleet and allowing foreign powers to establish a permanent foothold inside France. An army was quickly assembled to retake the city, but the campaign began badly. The French forces surrounding Toulon were disorganized and poorly coordinated. Commanders argued over strategy, supplies were inconsistent, and early attacks failed to make meaningful progress. The Allied defenders held the hills and fortifications that surrounded the harbor, giving them commanding positions over the entire area. Among the officers sent to assist the operation was a young artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, he held no great authority. He was simply responsible for artillery organization within the army besieging the city. But almost immediately, he noticed something troubling about the French efforts. The army was attacking the wrong targets. Many of the commanders believed that capturing the city itself should be the main objective. They launched assaults against the outer defenses of Toulon, hoping that direct pressure would eventually force the defenders to surrender. Napoleon saw the situation differently. He spent long hours walking the hills surrounding the harbor, studying the terrain with careful attention. The geography of Toulon fascinated him. The city sat within a natural bowl formed by steep ridges and high ground. Whoever controlled those heights controlled the harbor. Napoleon realized that the British fleet was the true center of the enemy's strength. As long as the Allied ships remained anchored safely in the harbor, they could supply the defenders, bombard French positions, and evacuate troops whenever necessary. But if artillery could be placed on certain key hills overlooking the harbor, those ships would become dangerously exposed. Cannons firing from elevated positions could rain destruction onto the fleet below. Napoleon identified the most critical position of all, a fortified location known as Fort Leguillette, and the surrounding heights that commanded the entrance to the harbor. If French forces captured those heights and installed artillery there, the harbor would become a deadly trap for the Allied ships. The fleet would be forced to leave, and once the fleet left, the city could not hold. Napoleon presented this plan to his superiors with the confidence of a man certain of his analysis. Some officers initially dismissed the young captain. He was young, relatively unknown, and lacked the prestige that older commanders carried. But the logic of his argument was undeniable. Gradually, his ideas gained support. Napoleon was given greater responsibility for the artillery operations of the siege. The assignment suited him perfectly. Artillery required calculation, preparation, and precision, qualities he possessed in abundance. He immediately began reorganizing the artillery units. Cannons were gathered from across the region, including weapons taken from nearby fortresses. Supplies of powder and ammunition were stockpiled. New batteries were constructed along the hills, positioned carefully to support the planned assault. Napoleon worked with relentless energy. He supervised the construction of defensive trenches and artillery platforms, often laboring alongside the soldiers themselves. Mud, cold winds, and enemy fire made the work exhausting, but he seemed to thrive under the pressure. His intensity impressed many of the men around him. The soldiers noticed that the young officer rarely rested. He rode constantly between positions, inspecting guns, correcting placements, and adjusting firing angles. Every detail mattered to him. He believed victory depended on preparation. Once the artillery network was ready, the time came to execute the plan. In December 1793, French forces launched a coordinated assault aimed at seizing the key fortifications overlooking the harbor. The fighting began before dawn, with artillery bombardments shaking the hills and echoing across the water. Napoleon directed the fire of dozens of cannons, carefully concentrating their power against enemy positions. The explosions tore into defensive walls and forced the Allied troops to scramble for cover. Meanwhile, infantry units advanced toward the targeted heights. The defenders fought fiercely. British and Spanish soldiers held strong defensive positions and returned fire with determination. Musket shots cracked through the cold air, while cannonballs smashed into earthworks and stone walls. The battle raged for hours. At one point during the assault, Napoleon himself was wounded when a bayonet grazed his thigh during close combat near one of the fortifications. The injury was not severe, but it reminded everyone around him that he was willing to share the risks of the battlefield. Despite the resistance, the French troops slowly gained ground. The pressure of the artillery bombardment weakened the defenders, and repeated assaults gradually pushed them back from their positions. By the end of the day, French forces had captured several critical heights overlooking the harbor. Napoleon wasted no time. Even as the fighting continued, he ordered cannons dragged into the newly captured positions. Soldiers hauled the heavy guns across rough ground, struggling through mud and debris to place them where Napoleon needed them. By nightfall, French artillery stood ready above the harbor. The next morning, the bombardment began. Cannon fire thundered down onto the ships anchored below. Shells exploded across decks and smashed into rigging. The harbor that had once offered protection now became a dangerous trap. The British commanders quickly understood the situation. Remaining in Toulon meant risking the destruction of their fleet. Within days, the Allied ships began withdrawing from the harbor, evacuating troops and destroying as many French vessels as they could before leaving. Fires lit the night sky as ships burned in the port. The defenders inside the city were abandoned. Soon after, French troops entered Toulon and restored control to the revolutionary government. The victory was decisive. News of the success reached Paris quickly, and the revolutionary leaders were eager to reward the officer whose strategy had made the difference. Napoleon Bonaparte was promoted to brigadier general. At only 24 years old, he had risen from relative obscurity to the rank of general in the army of the French Republic. It was an extraordinary achievement. For Napoleon, however, the promotion meant something even more important than recognition. It confirmed his belief in himself. The ideas he had studied, the strategies he had imagined, the confidence he had developed during years of isolation, all had proven valid in the chaos of real battle. He had seen what others had not, and he had acted. The experience at Toulon shaped his understanding of warfare in ways that would define his future campaigns. He saw clearly how speed, concentration of force, and control of terrain could break even strong defenses. Victory did not always belong to the largest army. It belonged to the most decisive commander. But while Napoleon celebrated his success, the revolution continued to shake France with violence and uncertainty. The government in Paris was unstable, factions competed for power, and political alliances shifted constantly. Generals who succeeded on the battlefield one month could find themselves imprisoned the next if political winds changed. Napoleon understood this danger. He knew that his future would depend not only on military ability, but also on navigating the turbulent politics of revolutionary France. Yet, he also sensed something else. The revolution had destroyed many of the barriers that once limited ambition. Titles and noble birth mattered less than before. Skill, loyalty, and boldness were now the qualities most valued by the Republic. For someone like Napoleon, that meant opportunity. And opportunity was exactly what he intended to seize. The victory at Toulon had made his name known in military circles, but it was only the beginning. Greater challenges and greater victories lay ahead. Soon, he would command armies of tens of thousands. Soon, he would march across mountains and plains that few French commanders had dared to challenge. Soon, Europe itself would learn to recognize the name Napoleon Bonaparte. But for now, the young general stood at the threshold of his future, the smoke of Toulon still lingering in the air, and the path of ambition stretching far beyond the Mediterranean horizon. In the years following the victory at Toulon, France remained locked in a struggle for survival. The revolution had shattered the old political order, and the nation now faced enemies on nearly every border. Monarchies across Europe feared that the revolutionary ideas spreading from Paris might ignite similar uprisings within their own kingdoms. To prevent this, they formed coalitions designed to crush the French Republic before it could grow stronger. For the French army, this meant constant war. Napoleon Bonaparte, now a young brigadier general, found himself navigating both military campaigns and the dangerous politics of revolutionary France. The government in Paris shifted frequently as factions competed for control. Alliances formed and collapsed with alarming speed. At times, Napoleon's career seemed uncertain, threatened by political changes he could not fully control. Yet, his reputation from Toulon remained strong. His skill with artillery and his clear understanding of battlefield strategy had impressed powerful figures within the revolutionary government. Among those who took notice was Paul Barras, a political leader who would soon play an important role in Napoleon's rise. In 1795, France experienced another crisis when royalist forces attempted to overthrow the revolutionary government in Paris. Thousands of insurgents gathered and prepared to march on the National Convention, hoping to restore the monarchy. The government needed someone capable of defending the capital. Barras turned to Napoleon. The young general responded with the same clarity and decisiveness he had shown at Toulon. He quickly organized artillery positions throughout the city, placing cannons where they could dominate the streets through which the royalist crowds would advance. When the uprising began, Napoleon did not hesitate. His artillery opened fire with grape shot, a deadly form of ammunition that spread like a storm of metal fragments through tightly packed groups of attackers. The effect was devastating The royalist forces were scattered within minutes, their assault broken before it could gain momentum. The revolt collapsed. Napoleon's actions had saved the revolutionary government in Paris. Once again, he had demonstrated the power of decisive force applied at the right moment. His willingness to act quickly and without hesitation impressed the political leaders who now controlled France. Soon afterward, he received a new appointment that would transform his career forever. In early 1796, the government placed Napoleon in command of the Army of Italy. At first glance, the assignment did not appear especially promising. The Army of Italy was poorly supplied, poorly paid, and largely overlooked by the government in Paris. Most of France's military resources were concentrated along the Rhine River, where larger armies faced the main Austrian forces. The Italian front was considered secondary. The soldiers Napoleon inherited were exhausted and discouraged. Many had not received proper wages in months. Their uniforms were worn, their boots torn, and their food supplies inconsistent. Desertion had become common. When Napoleon arrived to take command, he found an army of roughly 37,000 men facing Austrian and Piedmont's forces that were larger, better equipped, and positioned defensively among the rugged mountains of northern Italy. But Napoleon saw something others did not. He saw possibility. Standing before his troops shortly after assuming command, he delivered a speech that would become famous. He acknowledged their hardships openly. "You are naked and ill-fed," he told them. "The government owes you much, but can give you nothing." Then he offered them something far more powerful: victory. He promised that rich and fertile lands lay beyond the mountains, lands filled with cities, wealth, and supplies. If they followed him into Italy and defeated the enemy armies waiting there, they would find not only glory, but also reward. His words struck the soldiers deeply. Napoleon possessed a gift for inspiring men. He understood their frustrations and ambitions. He spoke to them not as distant authority, but as a commander who shared their determination. Soon, the army began to feel something it had lacked for a long time: confidence. Napoleon moved quickly. Rather than advancing slowly against the combined Austrian and Piedmontese forces, he decided to strike between them. If he could separate the two armies, he could defeat them individually before they had time to unite. Speed would be his greatest weapon. In the spring of 1796, Napoleon launched his campaign. The fighting began in the mountains of northern Italy, where narrow roads wound through steep valleys and ridges. Maneuvering armies through such terrain required careful planning and relentless movement. Napoleon drove his soldiers forward with extraordinary energy. They marched rapidly from one position to another, often covering distances that surprised both allies and enemies. Austrian commanders struggled to predict his movements because he refused to follow traditional patterns of warfare. Within weeks, he achieved his first major success. At the Battle of Montenotte, French forces struck an isolated Austrian division and defeated it decisively. The victory broke the connection between the Austrian army and its Piedmontese allies. Napoleon immediately pressed the advantage. Rather than allowing the enemy time to reorganize, he attacked again and again in rapid succession. Battles at Millesimo, Dago, and Mondovì followed quickly. Each engagement pushed the opposing forces farther apart and weakened their ability to coordinate. The Piedmontese army soon found itself overwhelmed. Facing continued defeat, the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont requested peace. Within weeks of Napoleon's arrival in Italy, one of France's enemies had already been removed from the war. Now Napoleon could focus entirely on the Austrian forces. The campaign continued across northern Italy with astonishing momentum. French troops crossed rivers, seized fortified towns, and drove the Austrians back through the fertile plains of Lombardy. Napoleon's strategy relied on concentration of force. Instead of spreading his army thinly along a wide front, he repeatedly gathered his strength against specific enemy positions. When he attacked, he did so with overwhelming pressure. The Austrians struggled to adapt. Their commanders often moved cautiously, waiting for clearer information before committing troops. Napoleon exploited this hesitation mercilessly. By the time Austrian reinforcements arrived in one location, the French army had often already moved somewhere else. Victory followed victory. At Lodi, in May 1796, Napoleon faced Austrian forces defending a bridge across the Adda River. The enemy artillery commanded the crossing, making an assault extremely dangerous. But Napoleon understood that hesitation could allow the Austrians to escape. He ordered an attack. French soldiers charged across the bridge under intense fire, suffering heavy casualties, but eventually overwhelming the defenders. The Austrians retreated, leaving the road to Milan open. The Battle of Lodi had a powerful effect on Napoleon himself. Later in life, he would say that it was during this moment he first realized his own destiny. Standing amid the smoke of battle, watching his soldiers follow him through deadly fire, he began to believe that he might truly be capable of extraordinary achievements. Soon after, French forces entered Milan. The wealthy city, long under Austrian control, now welcomed Napoleon as a liberator. Revolutionary ideals promised freedom from the old aristocratic rulers who had governed the region for generations. But the campaign was far from over. Austria continued sending new armies into Italy in an attempt to reclaim the territory. Several times, large Austrian forces attempted to relieve the fortress city of Mantua, a critical defensive stronghold still resisting French control. Each time Napoleon met them, battles at Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli became legendary examples of his tactical brilliance. Despite facing armies sometimes larger than his own, he used speed, terrain, and concentrated attacks to defeat them one by one. At Arcole, fighting lasted 3 exhausting days across marshy ground and narrow bridges. Napoleon himself famously seized a flag and attempted to lead soldiers forward across a bridge under enemy fire, hoping to inspire them by his example. Though the attack initially failed and he was nearly captured, the persistence of the French army eventually forced the Austrians to withdraw. Months later at Rivoli in January 1797, Napoleon achieved one of his greatest victories of the campaign. Austrian forces launched a massive effort to break through French positions and relieve Mantua. Napoleon reacted swiftly, concentrating his troops at critical points along the battlefield. Through careful maneuvering and relentless counterattacks, the French army shattered the Austrian assault. The victory sealed the fate of Mantua. Soon afterward, the fortress surrendered. With northern Italy now firmly under French control, Napoleon advanced toward Austria itself. His army marched through the Alps, approaching the heart of the Habsburg Empire. Alarmed by the rapid collapse of its defenses, Austria sought peace. In 1797, negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Campo Formio. The agreement recognized French control over large parts of northern Italy and confirmed Napoleon's stunning success. Only a year earlier, he had taken command of a neglected and struggling army. Now, he returned to France as a national hero. His victories had not only expanded French territory, but had also filled the treasury with wealth taken from conquered regions. Art, gold, and supplies flowed back toward Paris, strengthening the revolutionary government. Napoleon himself became a figure of fascination across France. Newspapers reported his victories with admiration. Paintings celebrated his battles. The young general, who had once struggled as an outsider from Corsica, was now one of the most famous men in the country. But fame was only the beginning. Napoleon had proven something to himself during the Italian campaign. He had commanded armies, defeated powerful enemies, and reshaped the political map of Europe. He had inspired loyalty among soldiers and commanded the attention of governments. Ambition, once a quiet fire within him, now burned brighter than ever. The Italian mountains had revealed his potential, and somewhere beyond the horizon, even greater opportunities were beginning to take shape. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned to Paris after his dazzling campaign in Italy, he was no longer an obscure general fighting distant battles in the mountains. His name had become known throughout France. Newspapers praised him as the brilliant commander who had humbled Austria and brought wealth and glory to the Republic. Paintings began to appear, showing him crossing bridges in battle or standing triumphantly before conquered cities. To many citizens, he seemed like the very embodiment of the revolutionary spirit, young, ambitious, and unstoppable. Paris welcomed him as a hero, but the capital was very different from the battlefields of Italy. Instead of smoke and cannon fire, the city offered salons filled with conversation, politics, and intrigue. Elegant gatherings took place every evening in the homes of influential figures where politicians, generals, writers, and socialites discussed the future of France. Napoleon moved carefully through this world. Though famous for his victories, he was still awkward in society. His Corsican accent remained noticeable, and his manners were often direct and intense compared with the polished behavior expected in Parisian circles. Yet his reputation gave him access to powerful people, and many were eager to meet the young general who had defeated Austria. It was in this environment that Napoleon met the woman who would soon become his wife. Her name was Josephine de Beauharnais. Josephine had lived a life filled with both privilege and tragedy. Born Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pagerie on the Caribbean island of Martinique, she had married a French aristocrat, Alexandre de Beauharnais, and moved to France long before the Revolution began. During the early years of the revolutionary turmoil, her husband had been arrested and executed during the Reign of Terror, leaving her a widow with 2 young children. She herself had narrowly escaped the same fate. By the time Napoleon met her in 1795, Josephine had become a well-known figure within Parisian society. She was graceful, charming, and skilled at navigating the complicated political environment of the capital. Though she was several years older than Napoleon, she possessed a quiet confidence and warmth that drew people toward her. Napoleon fell in love with her quickly and intensely. His letters from this period reveal a man overwhelmed by emotion. He wrote to her constantly, expressing longing and devotion with passionate language. For someone often described as cold and calculating in military matters, Napoleon showed remarkable vulnerability in his feelings for Josephine. She, however, approached the relationship with more caution. Josephine appreciated Napoleon's affection and admired his growing fame, but she had experienced enough hardship to understand how unpredictable life could be. Still, their connection deepened, and in March of 1796, they were married in a small civil ceremony in Paris. Napoleon was 26 years old. Only 2 days after the wedding, he left the capital to take command of the army of Italy. The timing seemed almost symbolic of the life he was destined to live. Even on the threshold of marriage, duty and ambition pulled him toward war. As he rode away from Paris toward the mountains of northern Italy, he carried with him not only the responsibilities of command, but also the image of the woman he adored. Throughout the Italian campaign, Napoleon wrote numerous letters to Josephine. These letters were filled with longing, jealousy, and romantic intensity. He described the loneliness he felt while separated from her and begged her to write often. At times, he confessed that victory itself meant little without her presence beside him. "Without you," he wrote in one letter, "the world has no joy." Yet while Napoleon poured his heart into these messages, Josephine's responses were often slower and more distant. Paris offered her a lively social life, filled with gatherings and friendships that occupied much of her attention. Napoleon did not know it at the time, but rumors began to circulate that Josephine had grown close to another man during his absence. For now, however, Napoleon remained focused on his campaign. His victories in Italy continued to transform the political map of Europe. Cities once ruled by Austrian governors now flew French revolutionary flags. New republics were established across northern Italy, organized according to revolutionary ideals. Napoleon became more than just a general. He acted as a political architect. He negotiated treaties, reorganized governments, and determined how conquered territories would be administered. His authority in Italy was immense, and he exercised it with growing confidence. At the same time, the wealth flowing from Italy back to France strengthened the government in Paris. Art treasures, gold, and supplies were transported across the Alps as symbols of French triumph. These resources helped sustain the Republic during a period when its survival still seemed uncertain. Napoleon's reputation continued to expand. Newspapers across Europe began reporting his victories with both fascination and alarm. Monarchs and diplomats studied his movements carefully, trying to understand how one young commander had managed to defeat several experienced Austrian generals in rapid succession. Even within France, some political leaders began to watch him cautiously, the revolutionary government known as the Directory ruled France during these years. It was a system designed to prevent any single individual from gaining too much power. Authority was divided among several directors who shared responsibility for governing the country. Napoleon's growing popularity made some of them uneasy. They admired his victories, but also recognized the danger of a general whose fame might eventually overshadow the government itself. For the moment, however, Napoleon remained loyal to the Republic. He had no army within France itself, and his ambitions were still focused primarily on military success. The campaign in Italy had given him confidence in his abilities, but it had also awakened something deeper within him, a sense that he might be capable of shaping the future of entire nations. This belief grew stronger with every victory. When the Treaty of Campo Formio was signed in 1797, bringing peace between France and Austria, Napoleon returned to Paris once again. This time, his fame had grown even larger. Crowds gathered to see him. Political leaders greeted him with admiration. Artists painted portraits of the victorious general. Stories of his battles circulated widely, sometimes exaggerated into legends. Yet beneath the celebrations, Napoleon felt restless. Peace did not suit him easily. The years of constant movement and decision during the Italian campaign had awakened an energy within him that ordinary life could not satisfy. He began thinking about new opportunities for adventure and expansion. France remained at war with Great Britain, its most powerful enemy. Direct invasion across the English Channel seemed nearly impossible because the British Navy dominated the sea. Napoleon began considering another possibility. If France could not easily defeat Britain in Europe, perhaps it could strike at British interests elsewhere in the world. His thoughts turned toward Egypt. At the time, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire but held enormous strategic importance. Control of Egypt could threaten British trade routes to India, one of the most valuable parts of the British Empire. Napoleon imagined leading an expedition there. The idea fascinated him. Egypt represented not only military opportunity, but also the chance to connect himself with the ancient civilizations that had long captured his imagination. He had read about the pharaohs, the pyramids, and the mysterious history of the Nile. Now, he considered the possibility of walking among those ancient monuments himself. The French government also saw advantages in the plan. Sending Napoleon to Egypt would strike at British interests, while also keeping the ambitious general far from the politics of Paris. For some members of the Directory, this seemed like a convenient solution. Preparations began quietly. Ships were gathered in Mediterranean ports. Soldiers were recruited for the expedition. Scientists, scholars, and artists were even invited to accompany the army in order to study the ancient land they would soon enter. Napoleon embraced the project with enthusiasm. To him, the Egyptian expedition promised not only glory, but also the chance to connect military conquest with intellectual discovery. He imagined bringing French knowledge and revolutionary ideals to lands that Europeans often viewed as mysterious and ancient. In the spring of 1798, the fleet carrying Napoleon and his army departed from France. As the ships sailed across the Mediterranean, Napoleon stood on the deck looking toward the distant horizon. Behind him lay the victories of Italy, the complicated love he shared with Josephine, and the growing fame that surrounded his name. Ahead of him lay Egypt. It was a land of desert and ancient stone, of pyramids that had stood for thousands of years before his birth. And somewhere within Napoleon's mind was the growing belief that his own story might one day stand beside those ancient monuments in the memory of history. The expedition would soon test that belief, because the deserts of Egypt would bring triumphs, discoveries, and dangers that Napoleon had never faced before. In the early summer of 1798, the waters of the Mediterranean carried one of the most unusual military expeditions Europe had ever seen. A vast French fleet moved steadily southward, its ships heavy with soldiers, cannons, supplies, and an unexpected cargo that revealed much about the ambitions of the man leading the expedition. Alongside the army traveled more than 100 scholars, scientists, engineers, artists, and mathematicians. Napoleon Bonaparte had insisted on bringing them. To him, the invasion of Egypt was not merely a military operation. It was also an intellectual mission, an attempt to study and understand one of the oldest civilizations in human history. He believed that conquest and knowledge could move forward together, that France could reshape the modern world while also uncovering the secrets of the ancient one. As the fleet moved across the sea, Napoleon spent long hours on deck, staring toward the horizon. The campaign ahead promised danger and uncertainty, yet it also stirred something deeply personal within him. Egypt had fascinated him for years. He had read about the pharaohs, the temples of Luxor, the vast pyramids rising from the desert sands. These monuments represented a world far older than anything in Europe, a civilization that had flourished thousands of years before Rome, before Greece, before even the earliest kings of France. Napoleon admired the idea of enduring greatness. The ancient rulers of Egypt had built monuments that survived centuries. Their names still echoed across history, long after their empires had vanished. Somewhere in Napoleon's imagination was the thought that his own name might someday be remembered in the same way. But first, he needed to reach Egypt. The British Navy dominated the Mediterranean and represented the greatest threat to the expedition. If the fleet were discovered and intercepted at sea, the invasion could fail before it even began. For weeks, the ships sailed cautiously, avoiding known British patrol routes. The tension among the officers was constant. At any moment, sails might appear on the horizon, revealing a British squadron ready for battle. Yet luck favored Napoleon. The British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson searched the Mediterranean for the French expedition, but repeatedly missed it by narrow margins. Storms, inaccurate reports, and the vastness of the sea allowed the French ships to slip through undetected. Before reaching Egypt, Napoleon decided to capture the island of Malta. Malta sat strategically along the route between Europe and North Africa. The island was controlled by the Knights of St. John, a military order that had ruled there for centuries. Though once powerful, the Knights had grown weak and divided. Napoleon's fleet appeared suddenly before the island in June 1798. Faced with overwhelming force, the Knights surrendered quickly. Within days, Malta fell into French hands. Napoleon reorganized its government, seized its treasures, and moved on toward Egypt with renewed confidence. Soon afterward, the fleet approached the Egyptian coast. The land appeared as a narrow strip of sand and rock rising from the sea, beyond which stretched the vast desert of North Africa. In July 1798, French troops began landing near the port city of Alexandria. The invasion had begun. Egypt at that time was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but real power within the region belonged to a group of military rulers known as the Mamluks. These men were famed horsemen, warriors who had governed Egypt for generations. They possessed courage and skill in battle, but their armies were built on traditions that had changed little over centuries. Napoleon's army represented something different: modern discipline, organized infantry formations, and above all, the devastating firepower of artillery. After securing Alexandria, Napoleon began marching his army inland toward Cairo, the heart of Egypt. The journey was grueling. The soldiers were unprepared for the harsh conditions of the desert. The heat was relentless. Water was scarce. Sand filled the air, stinging eyes and skin while slowing every movement. Many soldiers struggled with exhaustion and illness. Yet Napoleon pushed them forward with determination. He knew that the Mamluk forces would attempt to confront him before he could establish full control over the region. Speed and decisive action remained his greatest advantages. Soon the two armies met near the village of Mbabe, not far from the towering pyramids of Giza. It was July 21st, 1798. The pyramids stood in the distance like silent witnesses to the approaching battle. Their massive stone shapes had watched countless centuries pass, and now they would observe another clash of armies beneath the desert sun. Napoleon gathered his officers and gave an order that would become legendary. From the pyramids, he told his soldiers, 40 centuries looked down upon them. The words were dramatic, perhaps even theatrical, but they captured Napoleon's ability to connect the present moment with the vast sweep of history. He wanted his soldiers to feel that they were part of something larger than a simple battle. They were standing where ancient civilizations had once flourished, and now they would write their own chapter in that history. The Mamluk army charged with confidence. Their cavalry was magnificent, riders in bright garments mounted on powerful horses, armed with curved swords and pistols. For centuries, such warriors had dominated battlefields across the Middle East. But Napoleon had prepared his army carefully. He arranged his infantry into massive square formations, each side lined with soldiers holding muskets and bayonets. Cannons were positioned at the corners, ready to fire into any approaching enemy. These squares were nearly impossible for cavalry to break. When the Mamluk riders charged, they met disciplined volleys of musket fire and blasts of artillery. Horses fell, riders were thrown to the ground, and the momentum of the attack shattered against the steady French formations. Again and again, the Mamluk cavalry attempted to break the squares. Each time they failed. Within hours, the battle was decided. French forces crushed the Mamluk army and secured control of Cairo soon afterward. Napoleon had won one of his most dramatic victories. Yet while the triumph at the Battle of the Pyramids secured Egypt on land, disaster soon followed at sea. the French fleet remained anchored in Aboukir Bay near the mouth of the Nile River. Its presence was essential for maintaining communication and supply lines with France. But Admiral Nelson had finally located the French ships. On the evening of August 1st, 1798, the British fleet attacked. The Battle of the Nile became one of the most devastating naval defeats in French history. Nelson's ships maneuvered aggressively, attacking the French line from both sides. Cannon fire roared across the dark waters as explosions illuminated the night sky. One French warship after another was destroyed or captured. By the end of the battle, most of the French fleet had been annihilated. Napoleon's army was now stranded in Egypt. The news of the naval disaster struck the French forces like a thunderclap. Without a fleet, returning to France would be extremely difficult. The expedition that had begun with such bold ambition now faced isolation in a foreign land. Napoleon, however, refused to allow despair to dominate the situation. He focused instead on strengthening French control within Egypt itself. Cairo became the center of his administration. He established governing councils, reorganized taxation systems, and attempted to present himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Proclamations were issued claiming respect for local traditions and religion. Meanwhile, the scholars who had accompanied the expedition began studying the land around them. They measured ancient monuments, copied inscriptions, and documented the architecture of temples and tombs. Their work would eventually produce the monumental Description de l'Égypte, one of the most important studies of ancient Egyptian civilization ever created. One of the most famous discoveries occurred in 1799 when French soldiers uncovered the Rosetta Stone near the town of Rosetta. The stone contained inscriptions written in 3 different scripts, including ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek. This discovery would later provide scholars with the key needed to finally decipher the long-lost language of the pharaohs. But while scientific exploration flourished, Napoleon's military situation became increasingly difficult. Rebellions broke out in Cairo as local populations resisted French rule. Ottoman forces prepared new campaigns to drive the invaders from Egypt. British naval power continued to dominate the Mediterranean. Napoleon fought several more battles to maintain his position. At Aboukir in 1799, he defeated an Ottoman army attempting to land along the Egyptian coast. Once again, his tactical skill produced victory. Yet he understood that the larger situation remained unstable. Far away in Europe, political events were unfolding that would soon reshape his destiny. France itself was struggling under weak leadership and continued military pressure from foreign powers. Napoleon began to realize that his future might no longer lie in Egypt. The revolutionary government in Paris appeared fragile. Political divisions weakened its authority. France needed strong leadership, and Napoleon increasingly believed that he might be the man capable of providing it. In August 1799, he made a decision that would change the course of history. Leaving his army behind in Egypt under the command of trusted generals, Napoleon secretly departed aboard a small fleet of ships heading back toward France. The journey was risky. British warships still patrolled the Mediterranean, and capture would mean the end of his career. But fortune, once again, favored him. After weeks at sea, Napoleon reached the French coast safely. The general who had conquered Italy and marched beneath the pyramids had returned home. And now, the political future of France stood open before him. When Napoleon Bonaparte stepped once again onto French soil in October of 1799, the country he returned to was exhausted. Years of revolution had transformed France completely, yet stability still remained elusive. Governments had risen and fallen in rapid succession, each promising order but delivering uncertainty. The monarchy had been destroyed, the king executed, and the republic established in its place. But the republic itself now struggled under the weight of political division, economic problems, and the constant pressure of war. The government ruling France at the time was known as the Directory. It consisted of 5 directors who shared executive power, supported by 2 legislative assemblies. The system had been designed carefully to prevent any single individual from gaining too much authority. The memory of royal absolutism remained fresh, and many feared that concentrating power again in one person might recreate the tyranny the revolution had fought to destroy. In practice, however, the Directory proved weak. Corruption spread among officials. Political infighting paralyzed decision-making. Economic conditions worsened as inflation and shortages affected ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, France remained locked in conflict with several European powers determined to overthrow the revolutionary regime. Public confidence in the government steadily declined. By the time Napoleon returned from Egypt, many people in France believed that the revolution had reached a dangerous crossroads. They feared that continued instability might eventually lead to civil war or foreign invasion. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Napoleon's arrival created immediate excitement. News of his victories in Italy and Egypt had preceded him. To many citizens, he appeared as a symbol of strength and success, a leader capable of restoring order and protecting the nation. Crowds gathered wherever he traveled, but Napoleon himself did not rush blindly into politics. Instead, he spent his first days in France quietly observing the situation and reconnecting with influential figures who might support his ambitions. Among the most important of these figures was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. Sieyès was a prominent political thinker and one of the directors within the government itself. For months, he had been searching for a way to reform the failing system of the Directory. He believed that France needed a stronger executive authority, someone capable of stabilizing the nation while preserving the core principles of the revolution. But Sieyès lacked one essential element. He needed a general, a man respected by the army, admired by the public, and willing to use force if necessary to reshape the government. When Napoleon returned from Egypt, Sieyès realized that he had found the partner he needed. The 2 men met soon after Napoleon's arrival in Paris. Their conversations were cautious, but increasingly focused on a shared conclusion. The Directory could not continue as it was. Change was inevitable. The question was how that change would occur. If political reform happened slowly through ordinary legislative processes, the opportunity might be lost. Opponents within the assemblies could block new proposals, and rival factions might plunge the government into further chaos. But if reform came through decisive action, it might be possible to replace the existing system with something stronger and more stable. Napoleon understood this logic well. He had spent years commanding armies in situations where hesitation meant defeat. Speed and determination often proved more effective than prolonged debate. Gradually, a plan began to take shape. The conspirators would engineer a political crisis that justified moving the legislative assemblies outside Paris for their own safety. Once relocated, they would place the assemblies under the protection of troops loyal to Napoleon. With military support surrounding them, the legislators could be persuaded or pressured to dissolve the Directory and approve a new constitution. The plan was risky. If it failed, Napoleon and his allies might face arrest or execution. Revolutionary France had little patience for conspiracies against the government, but Napoleon believed that success depended on boldness. The date chosen for the operation corresponded to the revolutionary calendar then used in France. It was the 18th day of Brumaire, year 8. In the traditional calendar, it was November 9th, 1799. On the morning of that day, events began moving rapidly. Napoleon appeared before the Council of Ancients, one of the legislative assemblies, and warned that a dangerous conspiracy threatened the Republic. For the safety of the government, he argued, the assemblies should temporarily relocate to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, outside the city. The council agreed. Napoleon was appointed commander of the troops, responsible for protecting the legislators during this emergency. With that decision, he gained legal authority to command soldiers in the immediate area. Meanwhile, the directors themselves began resigning under pressure from the conspirators. Within hours, the leadership of the Directory had effectively collapsed. But the situation soon became chaotic. When the two legislative councils assembled at Saint-Cloud the following day, many members realized that they were witnessing a coup. Anger and confusion spread through the chambers as rumors circulated about Napoleon's intentions. Napoleon himself entered the assembly hall to address the Council of 500. The reaction was explosive. Many deputies shouted accusations, claiming he had betrayed the Republic. Some demanded that he be declared an outlaw. The chamber erupted into shouting and chaos as legislators surged toward him. For a moment, the entire plan seemed on the verge of collapse. Napoleon, accustomed to commanding soldiers rather than arguing with politicians, struggled to control the situation. Surrounded by angry deputies, he appeared shaken. At that critical moment, his brother Napoleon Bonaparte intervened. Napoleon was serving as president of the Council of 500. Seeing the danger, he stepped outside and addressed the soldiers guarding the building. He claimed that violent extremists inside the chamber were threatening Napoleon and attempting to destroy the Republic. The soldiers responded quickly. Led by General Joachim Murat, they entered the hall and dispersed the assembly by force. Deputies fled the chamber as troops advanced, effectively ending the legislative resistance to the coup. Later that evening, a small group of remaining legislators, carefully selected by the conspirators, approved the creation of a new provisional government. The Directory was gone. In its place stood a new system known as the consulate. Executive power would now rest with 3 consuls, the most powerful of whom was Napoleon Bonaparte. The revolution that had begun a decade earlier had entered a new phase. For many citizens, the change brought relief. Years of political instability had exhausted the country, and Napoleon's leadership promised order and direction. He moved quickly to strengthen the government. A new constitution was drafted that concentrated authority in the hands of the first consul, Napoleon himself. Though other institutions remained in place, real power increasingly flowed through him. At only 30 years old, Napoleon had become the most powerful man in France. Yet he was careful to present himself not as a dictator, but as the protector of the revolution. He promised to preserve the principles that had inspired the original uprising: equality before the law, religious tolerance, and opportunity based on merit. At the same time, he sought to restore stability. Administrative reforms reorganized government departments. Economic policies strengthened the national currency and improved taxation. The Bank of France was established to stabilize financial systems. Napoleon also turned his attention once again to the battlefield. France remained at war with several European powers, including Austria and Great Britain. The nation needed strong leadership to defend its borders and secure peace. Napoleon prepared to lead the army personally. The coming campaign would take him back across the Alps and into northern Italy, where new Austrian forces threatened the gains he had achieved during his earlier victories. The stage was set for another confrontation, but now Napoleon marched, not merely as a general seeking victory in battle. He marched as the leader of France itself. And with each step forward, his authority and his ambition continued to grow. When Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul of France at the end of 1799, he inherited a nation worn down by a decade of upheaval. The French Revolution had shattered the monarchy, rewritten laws, and transformed society. But it had also brought years of instability, economic hardship, and constant war. The people of France had lived through political purges, violent uprisings, and the rise and fall of several governments. What they wanted now was simple. They wanted order. Napoleon understood this better than anyone. He had studied history carefully, and he knew that revolutions often reached a moment when chaos exhausted the people who had once demanded change. At that moment, a strong leader who promised stability could gain enormous support. Napoleon intended to become that leader. The Constitution created after the coup of 18, Brumaire established the consulate, a government led by 3 consuls. On paper, the system appeared balanced, with multiple officials sharing authority. In reality, however, the Constitution concentrated power in the hands of the first consul, and Napoleon was the first consul. The other 2 consuls, Jean-Jacques Cambacérès and Charles-François Lebrun, were capable administrators, but their roles were largely advisory. Napoleon dominated the government from the beginning, guiding decisions, shaping policy, and controlling the direction of the nation. He worked with relentless energy. Napoleon often began his day before sunrise and continued working late into the night. Ministers, generals, and advisors were summoned to meetings where he questioned them intensely about every detail of their responsibilities. Reports were read carefully, decisions made quickly. He believed government should operate with the same efficiency as an army. France needed rebuilding in nearly every area of life. The economy had suffered terribly during the revolutionary years. Inflation had destroyed the value of paper currency, and government finances were unstable. Napoleon moved quickly to restore confidence. The Bank of France was created in 1800 to stabilize the financial system and regulate currency. New taxation methods improved the government's ability to collect revenue. Gradually, economic stability began to return. Napoleon also reformed the administrative structure of the country. Before the Revolution, France had been divided into regions controlled by nobles and local authorities with varying levels of independence. The Revolution had attempted to simplify the system, but chaos had disrupted many of those reforms. Napoleon reorganized the entire administration. France was divided into departments governed by officials known as prefects. These prefects were appointed by the central government and responsible directly to Paris. Through them, Napoleon ensured that laws and policies were carried out efficiently across the country. For the first time in French history, the state functioned with remarkable central control. Education became another priority. Napoleon believed that a strong nation required educated citizens, but he also believed education should serve the state. Schools were reorganized, and a network of secondary schools called lycée was established to train future administrators, officers, and professionals. Discipline and loyalty were emphasized. Students studied mathematics, science, history, and classical literature. But they were also taught respect for authority and duty to the nation. Perhaps the most lasting reform of Napoleon's early rule came in the form of legal changes. France had long suffered from a confusing mixture of laws inherited from feudal traditions, royal decrees, and revolutionary legislation. In some regions, different legal systems existed side by side. Napoleon wanted clarity. A team of legal scholars was assembled to create a unified system of law that would apply equally throughout the country. Napoleon himself participated actively in the discussions, often debating legal principles late into the night. The result was the Civil Code of 1804, later known as the Napoleonic Code. This new legal framework established several principles that reflected the ideals of the Revolution. It guaranteed equality before the law, protected private property, and eliminated many remaining feudal privileges. Citizens could pursue careers based on talent rather than noble birth. At the same time, the code reinforced strong authority within families and limited certain rights for women. Nevertheless, the Napoleonic Code became one of the most influential legal systems in modern history. Versions of it would eventually spread across Europe and beyond. Napoleon also sought to heal one of the deepest divisions created during the Revolution. Religion had been a source of intense conflict. Revolutionary leaders had attempted to weaken the Catholic Church, seizing church property and forcing clergy to swear loyalty to the state. Many French citizens, however, remained deeply religious and resented these policies. Napoleon recognized the importance of reconciliation. In 1801, he negotiated an agreement with Pope Pius VII, known as the Concordat. The agreement restored relations between France and the Catholic Church, while preserving many of the revolutionary reforms. Catholicism was acknowledged as the religion of the majority of French citizens, but the Church remained under the supervision of the state. Clergy were paid by the government, and bishops were appointed with Napoleon's approval. The arrangement satisfied many believers while ensuring that religious institutions would not challenge state authority. While Napoleon focused on rebuilding France internally, war continued beyond its borders. Several European powers remained hostile to the French Republic and suspicious of Napoleon's rise. Austria, in particular, threatened the territories France had gained during earlier campaigns in Italy. Napoleon decided to act personally. In the spring of 1800, he prepared for another campaign across the Alps. The plan was daring. Rather than attack through the traditional routes used by armies for centuries, Napoleon would lead his forces across the Great St. Bernard Pass, a high mountain route that surprised the Austrians completely. The journey across the Alps became legendary. Soldiers struggled along narrow paths carved into the mountainsides, dragging artillery pieces over snow and ice. Heavy cannons were loaded onto wooden sledges and hauled upward by teams of men and mules. The conditions were brutal, but the army pressed forward. Napoleon himself rode alongside the soldiers, encouraging them as they climbed toward the summit, though the famous painting by Jacques-Louis David later showed him heroically rearing on a horse among the peaks. The reality was more practical. He crossed the mountains on a mule like many others, yet the achievement remained extraordinary. The French army descended suddenly into northern Italy, catching the Austrian forces off guard. Within weeks, Napoleon confronted them near the village of Marengo on June 14, 1800. The battle began badly for the French. Austrian troops attacked aggressively and pushed Napoleon's forces backward throughout the morning. By afternoon, the situation appeared desperate. Many believed defeat was inevitable, but Napoleon refused to accept it. He ordered reinforcements under General Louis Desire to hurry toward the battlefield. As evening approached, Desire's troops arrived and launched a powerful counterattack against the advancing Austrians. The momentum of the battle shifted dramatically. French artillery opened fire, while infantry advanced with renewed energy. The Austrian army, believing victory was already secured, suddenly found itself under fierce pressure. Within hours, the Austrians retreated. The Battle of Marengo became another dramatic victory for Napoleon. The success strengthened his position enormously. In France, news of the triumph confirmed the belief that the first consul possessed extraordinary military genius. Soon afterward, Austria agreed to peace once again. In 1802, another major milestone followed. After years of conflict, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Amiens, temporarily ending hostilities between the two nations. For the first time in nearly a decade, Europe experienced a moment of widespread peace. Napoleon used this moment to consolidate his power further. In a national vote, the French people approved a change to the constitution that made him first consul for life. The title gave him enormous authority and ensured that he would remain the dominant political figure in France. Yet even this position did not fully satisfy his ambition. Napoleon had restored stability to France, defeated foreign enemies, and reorganized the nation's institutions. His popularity among the public remained high, and his army remained loyal. Gradually, a new idea began to take shape. France, he believed, needed more than a republic led by a consul. It needed an empire, and at the center of that empire would stand Napoleon himself. The next step in his journey would transform him from revolutionary leader into something far more powerful. He would become emperor. By the early years of the 19th century, France had changed profoundly under Napoleon Bonaparte's leadership. The chaos of the revolution had given way to order. Government institutions functioned efficiently, and the economy showed signs of recovery. Roads were repaired, schools reopened, and laws were applied consistently across the country. To many citizens, Napoleon had accomplished what no government since the Revolution had managed to achieve. He had restored stability, but stability alone did not fully explain the growing support for a new transformation that was beginning to take shape. Over the previous decade, France had abolished its monarchy and executed its king. The word emperor had once represented everything the revolution had fought against. Yet now, surprisingly, many people began to accept the idea that Napoleon should take that title. The reason lay partly in human nature and partly in Napoleon's own careful political strategy. For centuries, France had been ruled by powerful monarchs whose authority symbolized national unity. The revolution had destroyed that system, but it had not erased the deep cultural memory of centralized leadership. After years of instability, many citizens believed that a strong, permanent ruler might provide the security the country still needed. Napoleon also understood the importance of legitimacy. As first consul, he held enormous power, but his authority technically rested on the revolutionary government created after the coup of 1799. If that system collapsed, his position might collapse with it. Establishing a hereditary empire could provide continuity and stability that a temporary political office could not. Events soon accelerated this shift. In 1804, a royalist conspiracy was discovered that aimed to assassinate Napoleon and restore the Bourbon monarchy. The plot shocked the government and strengthened Napoleon's argument that France required stronger leadership to protect the achievements of the revolution. Supporters in the Senate proposed a solution. France should become an empire, and Napoleon Bonaparte should become its emperor. The proposal was presented carefully. Napoleon did not appear to demand the crown himself. Instead, it seemed to emerge from the will of the government and the people. A national vote was organized, and the result showed overwhelming support for the change. In May 1804, the Senate officially proclaimed Napoleon as Emperor of the French. The title itself carried meaning. He was not Emperor of France, which would have suggested ownership of the land. Instead, he was Emperor of the French, implying that his authority came from the people rather than divine right alone. Yet symbolism still mattered. Napoleon understood that a new empire required ceremony and spectacle. If he was to become emperor, the moment needed to impress not only the French population, but also the rulers of Europe. The coronation ceremony was planned for December 2nd, 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. preparations began months in advance. Notre Dame was transformed into a magnificent setting for the event. Decorations filled the vast interior, with banners, carpets, and golden ornaments placed throughout the cathedral. Nobles, diplomats, military officers, and government officials were invited to witness the historic moment. Napoleon also made a bold decision regarding the ceremony. He invited Pope Pius VII to attend. For centuries, European kings had been crowned by the authority of the Catholic Church. By inviting the Pope to Paris, Napoleon signaled that his empire would carry both political and religious legitimacy. The Pope accepted the invitation and traveled to France for the ceremony. On the morning of December 2nd, the streets of Paris filled with crowds eager to witness the spectacle. Carriages carrying officials and dignitaries moved slowly toward Notre Dame, their wheels rolling over streets lined with cheering citizens. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was one of solemn grandeur. Napoleon entered wearing a magnificent ceremonial robe embroidered with golden bees, a symbol chosen to represent both imperial authority and historical continuity with the ancient rulers of France. On his head rested a laurel wreath, reminiscent of Roman emperors, linking his image to the classical world he admired. Beside him stood Josephine, dressed in elegant white and gold. Despite the tensions that had sometimes troubled their marriage, Napoleon remained devoted to her. He had insisted that she be crowned empress during the ceremony. As the ritual began, Pope Pius VII performed the traditional blessings and prayers associated with coronation. The moment approached when the Pope would place the crown upon Napoleon's head. But something unexpected happened. Instead of allowing the Pope to crown him, Napoleon took the crown himself. Before the entire assembly, he lifted the crown and placed it upon his own head. The gesture stunned many observers. It carried powerful meaning. By crowning himself, Napoleon demonstrated that his authority did not come solely from the church or any external power. It came from his own achievements and from the will of the French people who had elevated him. After crowning himself, Napoleon turned to Josephine. He gently placed a crown upon her head as well, making her Empress of France. The cathedral filled with applause and ceremony as the new emperor and empress took their places before the assembled crowd. Trumpets sounded, banners waved, and the coronation concluded with a sense that a new era had begun. France was now an empire. Napoleon's transformation from revolutionary general to emperor had occurred in less than a decade. The young Corsican officer, who had once struggled as an outsider at military school, now stood as one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Yet the coronation did not end the challenges he faced. Across the continent, monarchs watched these developments with deep concern. Many rulers feared that Napoleon's growing power threatened the balance of Europe. They worried that his ambition might lead him to expand French influence far beyond its traditional borders. These fears soon proved justified. Tensions between France and Great Britain quickly rose again after the brief peace established by the Treaty of Amiens collapsed. Britain remained determined to resist French dominance, and diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly. Once more, Europe prepared for war. Napoleon began organizing his army for a possible invasion of Britain. Along the northern coast of France, thousands of soldiers gathered in camps near the English Channel. Ships and transport vessels were prepared in the hope that the French army might cross the narrow stretch of water separating France from its island rival. But the British Navy remained too strong. Without control of the sea, invasion was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Britain worked tirelessly to build a new coalition of European powers against Napoleon. Austria and Russia soon joined Britain in an alliance determined to defeat France and restore balance to the continent. War was inevitable. Napoleon responded with characteristic speed. Instead of continuing to prepare for an invasion of Britain, he turned his army eastward toward the approaching enemy forces. The massive military force assembled along the coast, known as the Grande Armée, began marching across Europe. It was one of the most disciplined and experienced armies ever assembled. Veterans of earlier campaigns marched alongside new recruits inspired by Napoleon's reputation. Officers who had proven themselves in Italy and elsewhere now commanded divisions and corps within the expanding army. As the soldiers moved toward Central Europe, Napoleon carefully studied the positions of the Austrian and Russian forces preparing to confront him. He planned a battle that would soon become one of the most famous victories in military history. It would take place near a small town called Austerlitz, and it would confirm Napoleon Bonaparte not only as emperor, but as one of the greatest battlefield commanders the world had ever seen. By the autumn of 1805, Europe once again stood on the edge of war. Napoleon Bonaparte had crowned himself Emperor of the French the previous year, a bold declaration that signaled his intention to reshape the political order of the continent. While many in France celebrated his leadership, the monarchies of Europe viewed his growing power with alarm. Great Britain had already resumed war against France, refusing to accept Napoleon's dominance in Western Europe. British diplomats worked tirelessly to organize a new coalition of nations willing to confront the expanding French Empire. Austria joined first. The Austrian Empire had been humiliated by Napoleon's victories during the Italian campaigns and again after the Battle of Marengo. Its rulers believed that another opportunity had arrived to defeat France and restore their influence. Soon, Russia also entered the alliance. Tsar Alexander I, the young ruler of Russia, viewed Napoleon as a dangerous revolutionary force whose ambitions threatened the balance of Europe. Russian armies began marching westward to support Austria. Together with Britain, these powers formed what became known as the Third Coalition. Napoleon understood that time was critical. For months, he had been preparing his army along the northern coast of France for a possible invasion of Britain. Thousands of soldiers had gathered near the English Channel, forming the massive force known as the Grande Armée. Now, instead of crossing the sea, Napoleon turned this army eastward. The movement was executed with remarkable speed. Entire corps of soldiers marched across France and into Central Europe in a coordinated advance that surprised the coalition forces. Roads filled with columns of infantry, cavalry, artillery wagons, and supply trains moving steadily toward the approaching enemy. Napoleon's plan was simple in principle, but complex in execution. He intended to strike the Austrian army before Russian reinforcements could fully unite with it. The Austrian commander, General Karl Mack, had positioned his forces in southern Germany near the city of Ulm. Confident that Russian support would arrive soon, Mack believed he could hold his position until the combined coalition armies were strong enough to confront Napoleon directly. But Napoleon moved faster than expected. Using a series of rapid maneuvers, French forces surrounded the Austrian army at Ulm before it fully understood what was happening. Corps under commanders such as Marshal Ney, Marshal Lanz, and Marshal Soult advanced along multiple routes, cutting off Austrian escape paths. The strategy worked perfectly. By October 1805, Mack's army found itself completely encircled. With no realistic chance of breaking through the French lines, he surrendered. Nearly 60,000 Austrian soldiers laid down their weapons. The victory at Ulm was astonishing. Napoleon had effectively destroyed a major enemy army without fighting a large battle. The triumph opened the road toward Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire. French troops marched into Vienna in November. The city, famous for its music and imperial splendor, now lay under French occupation. Napoleon had moved deep into the heart of Central Europe with breathtaking speed. But the war was not finished. Russian forces under Tsar Alexander I were still advancing across the region, determined to confront Napoleon and restore the coalition's position. The Austrian emperor himself joined the Russian army, hoping that together they could defeat the French emperor. The two sides eventually faced each other near the town of Austerlitz in what is now the Czech Republic. The date was December 2nd, 1805. It was exactly 1 year after Napoleon's coronation as emperor. The battlefield near Austerlitz consisted of rolling hills, frozen ponds, and scattered villages. At its center stood a high plateau known as the Pratzen Heights. Napoleon studied the terrain carefully. He deliberately positioned his army in a way that appeared weak in the center. French troops withdrew from the Pratzen Heights, leaving the high ground seemingly vulnerable. This was no mistake. It was bait. Napoleon expected the Allied commanders to believe that the French army was attempting to retreat. If they rushed forward to attack what they thought was a vulnerable center, they would abandon the high ground and stretch their forces across the battlefield. Then, Napoleon would strike. On the morning of December 2nd, a thick mist covered the fields around Austerlitz. The cold air hung silent as thousands of soldiers waited for the coming battle. Napoleon rode along his lines before the fighting began. He spoke to his soldiers with calm confidence, reminding them of their past victories and the importance of the moment ahead. Many of these men had marched with him across Italy and through the Alps. They trusted his leadership deeply. When the battle began, the Allied forces moved exactly as Napoleon had predicted. Believing the French center was weak, the Russian and Austrian armies launched a massive attack against it. Their troops descended from the Pratzen Heights and advanced through the fog toward the French positions. As they did so, they left the high ground increasingly exposed. Napoleon watched carefully from his command post. He waited until the moment was perfect. Then he gave the order. Marshal Soult's corps surged forward in a powerful counterattack aimed directly at the Pratzen Heights. French infantry climbed the slopes, driving into the thinning Allied lines that had moved away from the plateau. The sudden assault stunned the coalition commanders. Within a short time, French forces seized the high ground. Now, the battlefield belonged to Napoleon. From the Pratzen Heights, French artillery could dominate the surrounding terrain. Napoleon's army split the Allied forces in two, isolating their units and attacking them separately. Confusion spread rapidly among the coalition troops. Russian and Austrian soldiers attempted to reorganize, but the French attacks came from multiple directions. Cavalry charges smashed into retreating formations, while artillery fire shattered defensive lines. One of the most dramatic moments of the battle occurred near a series of frozen ponds on the battlefield's edge. As Allied troops attempted to retreat across the ice, French artillery fired into the frozen surface. The ice cracked and collapsed, sending soldiers, horses, and equipment plunging into the freezing water below. By late afternoon, the battle was decided. The Allied armies were in full retreat. The Battle of Austerlitz became one of the most decisive victories in military history. Napoleon had defeated two emperors, Alexander of Russia and Francis of Austria, in a single battle. The consequences were enormous. Austria quickly sought peace. The resulting Treaty of Pressburg forced Austria to surrender territory and recognize Napoleon's influence across much of Central Europe. Soon afterward, Napoleon reorganized several German states into a new alliance known as the Confederation of the Rhine. This effectively ended the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire. Across Europe, Napoleon's reputation reached its peak. Austerlitz became known as his greatest triumph, a masterpiece of strategy and deception that military historians would study for generations. The battle confirmed his status as one of the most brilliant commanders in history. For France, the victory meant security and prestige. The French Empire now dominated much of continental Europe. Napoleon placed members of his family on thrones across the region, creating a network of allied kingdoms loyal to him. His brothers became kings. Joseph ruled Naples, later Spain. Louis ruled Holland. Other relatives governed territories across Italy and Germany. Napoleon's empire seemed unstoppable. Yet even at the height of his power, one enemy remained beyond his reach: Great Britain. The British Navy continued to control the seas, and British leaders remained determined to resist Napoleon's ambitions. As long as Britain remained undefeated, the struggle for control of Europe would continue. Napoleon began searching for new ways to defeat this persistent rival. The next phase of his strategy would attempt to isolate Britain economically, rather than defeat it militarily. It was a plan that would reshape Europe once again, and it would draw Napoleon deeper into conflicts that would eventually test the limits of his empire. After the thunderous victory at Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the absolute height of his power. The armies of Austria and Russia had been defeated. The Holy Roman Empire had effectively disappeared, and French influence now stretched across much of Central Europe. Kings, princes, and diplomats throughout the continent watched carefully as Napoleon reorganized the political map according to his own vision. The transformation was dramatic. For centuries, the German lands had existed as a complex patchwork of hundreds of small states, loosely connected through the ancient structure of the Holy Roman Empire. That system had been fragile for generations, but Napoleon's victories finally shattered it completely. In its place, he created something new: the Confederation of the Rhine. This alliance brought together a group of German states under French protection. Their rulers pledged loyalty to Napoleon, and in return, they gained independence from Austrian influence. French troops could move through their territories, and their armies supported Napoleon's military campaigns. For Napoleon, the Confederation served several purposes. It weakened Austria permanently, strengthened French influence in Central Europe, and created a buffer zone between France and potential enemies to the east. It also demonstrated his growing authority as a political architect, not merely a military commander. At the same time, Napoleon continued placing members of his family on thrones across Europe. He believed that loyal relatives could help stabilize his expanding empire. His brother, Joseph Bonaparte, first became King of Naples. Later, Napoleon would move him to the throne of Spain. Another brother, Louis Bonaparte, became King of Holland. His stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, governed northern Italy, while other relatives and trusted allies ruled territories across Germany and Italy. Napoleon was building something that resembled a modern empire, but it was an empire constructed not through ancient dynastic inheritance, but through revolutionary change and military conquest. Despite these triumphs, one major obstacle remained: Great Britain. The island nation had avoided defeat thanks largely to its powerful navy. In 1805, the same year Napoleon won at Austerlitz, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson had destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar. That naval defeat had ended Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain directly. As long as the Royal Navy controlled the seas, the British Isles would remain beyond the reach of French armies. Napoleon needed another strategy. If he could not defeat Britain through invasion, perhaps he could weaken it economically. Britain's strength depended heavily on trade. Its merchants shipped goods across Europe and around the world. Factories produced textiles and other products that filled markets across the continent. If those markets were closed, Britain's economy might collapse. Napoleon decided to attempt something unprecedented. He would block Britain from trading with Europe. In 1806, he announced the creation of the continental system. The policy declared that all European nations under French influence must refuse trade with Britain. British goods were banned from continental ports, and ships suspected of trading with Britain could be seized. Napoleon believed that by isolating Britain economically, he could force the country into submission without needing to challenge its navy. At first, the plan seemed promising. Much of continental Europe was now either controlled by France or allied with Napoleon's empire. If all these territories enforced the blockade strictly, British merchants would lose access to enormous markets. But implementing the continental system proved far more difficult than Napoleon expected. Trade networks had existed across Europe for centuries. Merchants relied on British goods, and British markets bought large quantities of continental products. Closing those connections disrupted economies across the continent. Smuggling quickly became widespread. Merchants secretly transported British goods through neutral countries or hidden coastal routes. Officials tasked with enforcing the blockade often looked the other way, tempted by bribes or eager to avoid harming their own economies. Even some of Napoleon's allies struggled to comply fully. Portugal, for example, maintained strong commercial ties with Britain and resisted enforcing the blockade. For Napoleon, this refusal posed a serious challenge. Allowing Portugal to remain open to British trade could undermine the entire continental system. In response, Napoleon decided to act. In 1807, he ordered French forces to move into the Iberian Peninsula. The initial plan seemed simple. French troops would pass through Spain and occupy Portugal, forcing the Portuguese government to close its ports to British commerce. The Spanish monarchy, weakened by internal divisions, reluctantly allowed French armies to cross its territory. But Napoleon soon saw an opportunity to expand his control further. The Spanish royal family was deeply divided, and public confidence in the monarchy had eroded. Napoleon summoned the Spanish king and his son to a meeting in France, where he pressured them both into abdicating their claims to the throne. Then he installed his brother Joseph as the new king of Spain. What Napoleon expected to be a straightforward political change quickly became a disaster. The Spanish people reacted with fury. Across Spain, uprisings erupted against French occupation. Ordinary citizens, farmers, and local militias took up arms against Napoleon's forces. The rebellion spread rapidly, turning into a brutal guerrilla war. French soldiers now faced an enemy unlike any they had fought before. Instead of organized armies meeting on open battlefields, they encountered ambushes, sabotage, and constant harassment by small groups of fighters who knew the terrain intimately. The conflict became known as the Peninsular War. It would drain French resources for years. Britain quickly recognized the opportunity. British forces under the command of Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal to support Spanish resistance. Together, British and Spanish forces began pushing back against French control in the region. Napoleon had intended to strengthen his empire. Instead, he had opened a dangerous new front. At the same time, tensions with Russia began growing. Though Russia had initially cooperated with Napoleon after earlier treaties, Tsar Alexander I became increasingly uneasy about the continental system. Russian trade also suffered under the blockade, and the Russian economy struggled as exports declined. Gradually, Russia began loosening its enforcement of the trade restrictions. Napoleon saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. By the early 1810s, relations between France and Russia had deteriorated significantly. Both sides began preparing for the possibility of war. Meanwhile, the conflict in Spain continued draining French manpower and morale. Napoleon himself would eventually lead armies there in an attempt to restore control. But the resistance proved stubborn and relentless. For the first time since his rise to power, Napoleon faced a conflict that refused to end quickly. The empire he had built through brilliant victories now faced pressures from multiple directions. Britain remained undefeated. Spain had become a bleeding wound for French forces. Russia was growing increasingly hostile. Yet Napoleon still believed in his ability to overcome these challenges. His past successes had taught him that bold action could defeat even powerful enemies. He had crossed the Alps, shattered coalitions, and redrawn the map of Europe through determination and strategic genius. But the next decision he would make would prove to be the most dangerous gamble of his entire career. In 1812, Napoleon would lead the largest army Europe had ever seen into the vast lands of Russia, and there, the limits of his empire would finally begin to appear. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte placed his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain in 1808, he believed he was simply strengthening the structure of his empire. For years, he had reorganized Europe, replacing old monarchies with rulers loyal to France. Kingdoms had risen and fallen at his command, borders had shifted, and governments had been remade. But Spain would prove very different. Napoleon had underestimated something powerful and deeply rooted within the Spanish people: their fierce attachment to the traditions, their religion, and their independence. When news spread that the Spanish king had been forced to abdicate and that Napoleon intended to place his own brother on the throne, anger exploded across the country. On May 2nd, 1808, the citizens of Madrid rose in revolt against French troops stationed in the city. The uprising was chaotic and desperate. Crowds attacked French soldiers in the streets with knives, tools, and whatever weapons they could find. For a brief moment, the city seemed to slip out of French control, but the French army responded brutally. Marshal Joachim Murat, commanding French forces in Madrid, ordered a harsh crackdown. Soldiers opened fire on crowds and carried out mass executions of suspected rebels. The repression was swift and terrifying. Yet instead of crushing resistance, it ignited something larger. The violence in Madrid sparked up risings across Spain. Villages, towns, and entire regions rose against French rule. Ordinary people, farmers, priests, merchants, and craftsmen joined together to resist the occupying army. Spain became a battlefield. But this war was unlike the battles Napoleon had fought before. His earlier campaigns had been fought against organized armies on open fields. Victory often depended on maneuver, discipline, and decisive strategy. In Spain, the enemy rarely appeared in such clear formations. Instead, small groups of fighters struck suddenly from forests, mountains, and villages. They attacked French supply columns, ambushed patrols, and disappeared into the countryside before organized forces could respond. These fighters became known as guerrillas, a Spanish word meaning little war. The term would soon become famous. The guerrilla fighters had few uniforms and little formal training, but they possessed two powerful advantages: knowledge of the land and support from the local population. Villagers sheltered them, provided food, and warned them when French troops approached. For Napoleon's soldiers, every road, hill, and village became a potential threat. Supply lines became dangerously vulnerable. French convoys transporting food and ammunition were frequently attacked. Isolated soldiers could vanish without a trace. Even small journeys through the countryside required heavy escorts. The psychological toll on French troops was enormous. They faced an enemy that rarely fought directly, yet never disappeared. Every quiet valley might hide an ambush. Every peaceful village might conceal armed resistance. Napoleon himself soon realized that Spain had become something deeply troublesome. He reportedly referred to it as his ulcer. The term captured the nature of the conflict perfectly. Like a wound that refused to heal, the Spanish War drained the strength of his empire without offering a clear victory. To restore control, Napoleon decided to intervene personally. In late 1808, he marched into Spain with a massive army of veteran troops. His presence immediately changed the balance of the war. French forces defeated Spanish armies in several rapid battles, and Napoleon himself entered Madrid once again. For a moment, it seemed that French dominance might be restored. But the deeper problem remained. Even after Napoleon's victories, the guerrilla war continued across the countryside. French armies could occupy cities, but controlling the entire country proved nearly impossible. And now, another powerful enemy had arrived: Great Britain. The British government saw the Spanish rebellion as a perfect opportunity to weaken Napoleon's empire. British forces landed in Portugal to support both Portuguese and Spanish resistance. Leading those forces was a careful and determined commander named Arthur Wellesley. Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, approached the war with patience and discipline. Instead of risking reckless battles, he focused on building strong defensive positions and gradually pushing French forces out of Portugal. The rugged terrain of the Iberian Peninsula favored his strategy. Mountains, rivers, and narrow roads made large-scale maneuvers difficult. French armies, accustomed to rapid campaigns across Central Europe, found themselves slowed by geography, as well as constant guerrilla harassment. The war stretched on. Year after year, French troops fought to maintain control while British and Spanish forces slowly grew stronger. Victories came and went, but the conflict refused to end. Napoleon could not devote his full attention to Spain. His empire stretched across Europe, and threats continued emerging from other directions. New coalitions formed, alliances shifted, and tensions with Russia steadily increased. As a result, Napoleon eventually left Spain and returned to Central Europe, leaving his marshals to manage the conflict. But without his personal leadership, the situation worsened. French commanders struggled to coordinate their forces effectively across the difficult terrain. Guerrilla attacks continued disrupting communications and supplies. British troops gradually expanded their influence. By the early 1810s, hundreds of thousands of French soldiers had been tied down in the Spanish conflict. Men who might have strengthened Napoleon's armies elsewhere were instead fighting a grinding war with no clear end. The cost was enormous, not only in lives and resources, but also in reputation. Across Europe, news of the Spanish resistance inspired hope among Napoleon's enemies. If a determined population could challenge French rule successfully, perhaps other nations might do the same. Meanwhile, relations between Napoleon and Russia continued deteriorating. Tsar Alexander I had grown increasingly dissatisfied with the continental system. Russian merchants suffered from the blockade against British trade, and many nobles resented the economic damage caused by Napoleon's policies. Gradually, Russia began reopening its ports to British goods. For Napoleon, this was unacceptable. The continental system depended on unified enforcement. If Russia abandoned the blockade, Britain would regain access to one of Europe's largest markets. Napoleon believed he had no choice but to respond. By 1811, the signs of coming conflict were impossible to ignore. Armies gathered across Eastern Europe as tensions rose between the two empires. Napoleon began preparing for a campaign unlike any he had ever undertaken. The army he assembled would be the largest Europe had ever seen. Soldiers arrived from across the French Empire and its allied states. French veterans, Polish lancers, German infantry, Italian cavalry, Dutch troops, and many others. Together, they formed the Grand Army, nearly 600,000 men. The objective was simple in theory: march into Russia, defeat the Russian armies quickly, and force the Tsar to return to the continental system. Napoleon had defeated coalitions before. He believed he could defeat Russia as well. But Russia was not like the nations he had conquered in the past. Its territory stretched endlessly eastward. Its winters were brutal, beyond anything Western Europe had known. Its armies were willing to retreat rather than risk immediate destruction. The campaign that followed would become one of the most infamous disasters in military history. The road to Moscow awaited, and along that road, the empire Napoleon had built would begin to unravel. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. It was a force of extraordinary scale and diversity. Soldiers from nearly every corner of the French Empire marched together beneath Napoleon's command. French veterans who had fought in Italy and Germany stood beside troops from Poland, Italy, Holland, Bavaria, Saxony, and many other allied states. The Grand Army, as it was known, numbered more than 600,000 men. It was a massive instrument of war, designed to deliver a decisive blow that Napoleon believed would force Russia back into submission. For years, Tsar Alexander I had grown increasingly resistant to the continental system that Napoleon used to isolate Britain economically. Russian ports had gradually reopened to British trade, undermining Napoleon's strategy. Napoleon believed the solution was simple: defeat the Russian army quickly, capture a major city, and force the Tsar to negotiate peace. It had worked before. Time and again, Napoleon had won wars through rapid campaigns that shattered enemy armies before they could regroup. From Italy to Austria to Prussia, his opponents had fallen after a few decisive battles. But Russia was different. Its vast distances, harsh climate, and stubborn leadership would soon reveal weaknesses in Napoleon's approach that he had never before encountered. On June 24th, 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River and entered Russian territory. The invasion had begun. Napoleon expected the Russian armies to confront him near the border, but instead they retreated. Russian commanders understood that fighting Napoleon immediately could lead to disaster. His armies were too experienced, his tactics too refined. Instead, they adopted a strategy of withdrawal. As Napoleon advanced deeper into Russia, the enemy continued falling back. Villages were abandoned, supplies were removed or destroyed, fields were burned. This strategy, known as scorched earth, denied Napoleon the resources his army needed to survive. For the soldiers of the Grand Army, the campaign quickly became exhausting. The summer heat was intense. Roads turned to dust under the endless marching columns. Horses died from exhaustion, and supply wagons struggled to keep up with the advancing army. Napoleon pushed forward relentlessly. He believed the Russians would eventually be forced to fight. Weeks turned into months as the French army marched deeper into the vast Russian landscape. The distances were far greater than anything Napoleon had experienced in his earlier campaigns. By the time the army reached the city of Smolensk in August, thousands of soldiers had already been lost, not to battle, but to disease, hunger, and exhaustion. At Smolensk, the Russians finally made a stand. The battle was fierce and destructive. French artillery pounded the city, while Russian forces fought stubbornly to hold their positions. Eventually, the Russians withdrew again, leaving Smolensk burning behind them. Napoleon had captured the city, but the Russian army still remained intact. Frustration began growing within the French command. Napoleon needed a decisive battle. Without destroying the Russian army, the campaign could not truly succeed. Finally, in early September, the Russian forces stopped retreating. They prepared to fight near the village of Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow. The Battle of Borodino would become one of the bloodiest single-day battles of the entire Napoleonic Wars. On the morning of September 7th, 1812, more than 200,000 soldiers faced each other across the battlefield. Cannons lined the hills and fields as both armies prepared for a brutal confrontation. Napoleon studied the battlefield carefully. Though ill and suffering from fatigue, he commanded his army, as always, with careful attention to detail. The Russian defenses consisted of earthworks, fortifications, and artillery positions built to slow the French advance. The battle began with thunderous artillery fire. Cannonballs tore across the fields as infantry columns advanced toward the Russian defenses. French soldiers attacked repeatedly, capturing fortifications only to lose them again in fierce counterattacks. The fighting lasted all day. Entire units were nearly destroyed in the struggle. Smoke covered the battlefield, while wounded soldiers lay across the ground in horrifying numbers. By evening, the French army had pushed the Russians back from many of their positions. Technically, Napoleon had won the battle, but the victory came at an enormous cost. More than 70,000 soldiers from both sides were killed or wounded in a single day. The Russian army, though battered, managed to retreat once again rather than collapse completely. Napoleon had achieved another victory, but it was not the decisive victory he needed. The road to Moscow now lay open. A week later, the Grand Army marched into the ancient Russian capital. Napoleon expected that capturing Moscow would force Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace. For centuries, Moscow had been one of the spiritual and cultural centers of Russia. Its loss seemed certain to shock the Russian government into surrender. But when the French army arrived, something unexpected happened. The city was nearly empty. Most of Moscow's population had fled before the French arrival. Soon after Napoleon entered the city, fires began breaking out across its streets. At first, they appeared isolated, but the fire spread rapidly. Soon, enormous sections of Moscow were burning. Flames consumed homes, warehouses, and public buildings, strong winds carried the fire from one district to another until the city became an inferno. Napoleon watched helplessly as Moscow burned. The fires destroyed supplies that his army desperately needed. Food, shelter, and winter clothing disappeared in the flames. What remained of the city could barely support the massive army occupying it. Worst of all, Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate. Weeks passed with no response from the Russian government. Napoleon had captured Moscow. Yet the war was not over. Winter was approaching. The Grand Army, already weakened by months of marching and fighting, now faced the possibility of surviving in a devastated city with little food and no clear path to victory. Finally, Napoleon made the decision he had hoped to avoid. He would retreat. In October 1812, the Grand Army began its march westward out of Moscow. The retreat quickly turned into catastrophe. The Russian winter arrived with brutal force. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Snow covered the roads, and icy winds swept across the plains. Napoleon's soldiers were not prepared for such conditions. Many lacked proper winter clothing. Horses died in massive numbers, leaving artillery and wagons abandoned along the roads. Food became scarce as the army struggled to move through regions already stripped of supplies. Meanwhile, Russian forces harassed the retreating army constantly. Cavalry attacks struck isolated units. Cossack riders appeared suddenly from the snow, attacking supply wagons and stragglers. The once mighty Grand Army began to collapse. Starving soldiers fell behind and froze to death. Entire units dissolved into scattered groups, struggling simply to survive. One of the most desperate moments came at the crossing of the Berezina River in November. Russian forces attempted to trap the retreating army at the river banks. In freezing conditions, French engineers constructed makeshift bridges, while soldiers fought desperately to hold off the Russian attacks. Thousands died during the crossing, but Napoleon managed to save part of his army. By the time the survivors finally reached friendly territory in December, the scale of the disaster was clear. Of the more than 600,000 soldiers who had entered Russia, only a fraction remained. The Russian campaign had destroyed Napoleon's greatest army. Across Europe, the news spread quickly. For the first time in years, Napoleon appeared vulnerable, and his enemies were already preparing to take advantage of it. When the shattered remnants of Napoleon's Grand Army finally staggered out of Russia in the winter of 1812, Europe could scarcely believe what had happened. For nearly 15 years, Napoleon Bonaparte had dominated the continent. His armies had defeated one coalition after another. His strategies had humbled powerful monarchies, and his empire had stretched across vast regions of Europe. Now that empire had suffered a devastating blow. The Russian campaign had not merely been a defeat. It had been a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been lost to battle, starvation, disease, and the merciless Russian winter. Horses had died by the tens of thousands. Artillery had been abandoned in the snow, and entire units had disappeared during the long retreat. For the first time since Napoleon's rise to power, his enemies sensed that he might be beaten. Across Europe, governments that had long feared Napoleon suddenly saw an opportunity. Prussia, which had been forced into humiliating alliances with France after earlier defeats, began preparing to break free. Austria, Napoleon's former enemy and reluctant ally, watched events carefully and reconsidered its loyalties. Most importantly, Russia remained determined to continue the war. Tsar Alexander I understood that Napoleon's army had been severely weakened. Instead of accepting peace after driving the French out of Russia, he chose to push westward and carry the fight into the heart of Europe. A new coalition began to form. Russia, Prussia, Britain, Sweden, and eventually Austria joined together in what became known as the Sixth Coalition. Their goal was simple: destroy Napoleon's empire and end French domination of the continent. Napoleon himself returned to Paris in December 1812, leaving the surviving troops to regroup behind him. Despite the scale of the disaster, he refused to surrender. His confidence remained extraordinary. France still possessed resources, manpower, and experienced commanders. Napoleon believed that if he could rebuild his army quickly enough, he might still defeat the coalition before it fully united. Within months, he began raising new forces. Young recruits filled the ranks of the French army. Many of them were barely trained and far younger than the hardened veterans who had once marched through Italy and Germany. Yet Napoleon worked tirelessly to transform these recruits into an effective fighting force. By the spring of 1813, he had assembled a new army. Though not as experienced as his earlier forces, it was still formidable. Napoleon personally led the army eastward once again, determined to stop the advancing coalition before they could invade France. The first major battles of the new campaign took place in Germany. At the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen in May 1813, Napoleon managed to defeat Russian and Prussian forces. These victories demonstrated that despite the disaster in Russia, Napoleon still possessed remarkable military skill. His ability to maneuver armies and exploit enemy mistakes remained unmatched. Yet something had changed. The coalition armies were learning from past defeats. Instead of confronting Napoleon directly whenever possible, they began adopting a new strategy: avoid Napoleon himself. Coalition commanders understood that Napoleon's presence on the battlefield often meant defeat. His ability to react quickly, concentrate forces, and exploit weaknesses had destroyed enemy armies repeatedly. So they chose a different approach. Whenever Napoleon personally commanded French troops, they avoided major battle. Instead, they targeted French forces led by his marshals elsewhere, defeating them individually and gradually weakening the overall French position. At the same time, coalition armies grew larger. More nations joined the alliance, and their combined manpower eventually surpassed what Napoleon could raise. Even as he won battles, the coalition continued expanding its strength. During the summer of 1813, a temporary armistice paused the fighting. Napoleon hoped the pause might lead to negotiations, but the coalition used the time to strengthen its armies further. When the war resumed in the autumn, the scale of the conflict grew even larger. In October 1813, Napoleon faced the coalition armies near the city of Leipzig in Germany. The battle that followed became known as the Battle of Nations. It was one of the largest battles ever fought in Europe before the 20th century. More than 500,000 soldiers participated, representing nearly every major power on the continent. The fighting lasted 4 days. Napoleon commanded the French forces with determination and skill. But the numbers against him were overwhelming. Coalition armies attacked from multiple directions, gradually tightening their grip around the French positions. For a time, Napoleon managed to hold his ground, but as the battle continued, more coalition reinforcements arrived. Some German allies who had previously supported Napoleon even switched sides during the fighting. The pressure became impossible to sustain. Eventually, Napoleon ordered a retreat. During the withdrawal, a bridge across the Ulster River was accidentally destroyed too early, trapping thousands of French soldiers inside Leipzig. Many were captured or killed as the coalition forces closed in. The defeat at Leipzig was a turning point. Napoleon's control over Germany collapsed. French forces retreated westward toward France itself, while the coalition armies advanced relentlessly. The empire that had once stretched across Europe was beginning to unravel. Former allies abandoned Napoleon. Kingdoms he had created dissolved as their rulers switched loyalty to the coalition. Even within France, exhaustion from years of war was growing. Napoleon still refused to surrender. In early 1814, coalition armies crossed the borders of France. For the first time in decades, foreign troops marched across French soil. Napoleon responded with one last display of military brilliance. During what became known as the 6 Days Campaign, he launched a series of rapid attacks against separated coalition forces. In several battles, he managed to defeat larger armies through speed and clever maneuvering. For a moment, it seemed possible that he might repeat the miracles of his earlier career. But the situation was too overwhelming. Coalition armies continued advancing toward Paris from multiple directions. Even as Napoleon won small victories, the overall strategic position deteriorated. In March 1814, the coalition reached Paris. The city surrendered after brief resistance. Napoleon, still commanding troops in the field, suddenly found himself cut off from the capital. His marshals, realizing the war was lost, urged him to abdicate. After years of triumph, Napoleon faced a reality he had rarely encountered: defeat. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated the throne of France. The coalition powers decided not to execute or imprison him permanently. Instead, they reached an unusual compromise. Napoleon would be allowed to rule a small island in the Mediterranean, the island of Elba. It was a tiny territory compared to the vast empire he had once controlled, but it allowed him to retain the title of emperor and live in relative comfort. In April 1814, Napoleon left France for Elba. As he departed, soldiers who had once marched across Europe under his command stood in silence. Many of them had followed him for years, through victory and disaster alike. Now their emperor was leaving. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France, and King Louis XVIII returned to the throne. Across Europe, leaders believed the Napoleonic era had finally ended. But they underestimated one thing. Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man who accepted exile easily. From his small island in the Mediterranean, he continued watching events in France. And before long, he would decide to return. In the spring of 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte arrived on the island of Elba as a defeated emperor. The journey from France to the small Mediterranean island marked one of the most dramatic reversals in history. Only a year earlier, He'd commanded the largest army Europe had ever seen. His empire had stretched across vast regions of the continent, and kings had ruled under his authority. Now his world had shrunk to a small island barely 20 miles long. Elba lay off the coast of Italy, surrounded by clear blue waters and rugged hills covered in olive trees and vineyards. It was peaceful, quiet, and far removed from the battlefields where Napoleon had spent most of his adult life. For many rulers in Europe, this arrangement seemed ideal. Napoleon would remain alive, but isolated, unable to threaten the continent again. He retained the title of emperor, but his empire consisted only of the island and its small population of around 12,000 people. They believed he would fade quietly into history. But Napoleon was not the kind of man who disappeared easily. When he first arrived on Elba, he quickly began reorganizing the island's administration. True to his nature, he approached even this small domain with the energy of a ruler determined to improve everything he touched. He inspected roads, reorganized agriculture, and improved mining operations on the island. New construction projects were started, and the local economy began to stabilize under his leadership. Napoleon also maintained a small personal army of several hundred loyal guards. These men, veterans who had served him faithfully through years of war, remained devoted to their former emperor. They wore their uniforms proudly and accompanied Napoleon during inspections and ceremonies across the island. From the outside, it appeared as though Napoleon had accepted his fate. But beneath the surface, his mind remained active. He followed events in France closely. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored under King Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed Louis XVI. After decades of revolution and war, many Europeans hoped that the return of the monarchy would restore stability. Yet the situation in France was complicated. Many citizens were uneasy about the restored royal government. The revolution had changed French society in profound ways, and not everyone welcomed the return of a traditional monarchy. Soldiers who had served under Napoleon felt uncertain about their place in the new order. The army itself was restless. Napoleon had built his reputation alongside thousands of soldiers who had risen through the ranks because of talent and bravery, rather than noble birth. Under the restored monarchy, some feared that the old aristocratic privileges might return. At the same time, economic problems continued troubling the country. Taxes were unpopular, and many citizens felt disconnected from the new royal administration. Napoleon watched these developments carefully from Elba. Reports reached him regularly through visitors, letters, and secret communications. Gradually, he began to realize that his story might not be finished. France was unsettled, and many people still remembered the years when Napoleon had ruled. In early 1815, he made a decision that shocked Europe. He would return. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon quietly left Elba with a small fleet of ships and about 1,000 loyal soldiers. The departure was swift and secretive. By the time authorities realized what had happened, his ships were already sailing toward the French coast. On March 1st, he landed near the town of Golfe-Juan in southern France. The return of Napoleon had begun. The situation was incredibly dangerous. If the French army remained loyal to King Louis XVIII, Napoleon's small force would be crushed quickly. Thousands of royal troops stood between him and Paris, but Napoleon understood something powerful about the soldiers of France. Many of them had once marched with him. He began moving north toward the capital. Instead of attacking cities or forcing his way forward violently, Napoleon chose a different strategy. Whenever royal troops blocked his path, he approached them calmly. At one famous moment near the town of Grenoble, Napoleon confronted a group of soldiers sent to arrest him. He stepped forward alone, opened his coat, and addressed them directly. "If there is among you a soldier who wishes to kill his emperor," he reportedly said, "here I am." For a moment, the soldiers hesitated. Then someone shouted, "Vive l'empereur!" "Long live the emperor!" The soldiers lowered their weapons and joined him. Again and again the same thing happened. Units sent to stop Napoleon instead joined his growing force. Word spread rapidly across the country that he had returned. Crowds gathered along the roads as he advanced northward. The king's government began to panic. King Louis XVIII realized that the army could not be relied upon to stop Napoleon. As Napoleon approached Paris, the king fled the city and went into exile. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon entered Paris once again, without firing a shot. His return shocked Europe. The rulers who had believed the Napoleonic era was finished suddenly realized they faced the same enemy once again. Diplomats meeting in Vienna, where European leaders had been negotiating the political future of the continent, immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw. They formed another coalition to defeat him. This time, they were determined to finish the task completely. Napoleon knew he had little time. The coalition armies were already mobilizing. British, Prussian, Austrian, and Russian forces prepared to march against France once more. Napoleon attempted to stabilize the political situation quickly. He promised a more liberal constitution and tried to reassure the French public that he did not intend to rule as an absolute dictator. At the same time, he focused his attention on rebuilding the army. Thousands of soldiers returned to his banners, yet the resources available to him were far smaller than in previous wars. France had been exhausted by years of conflict, and many experienced veterans were gone. Still, Napoleon remained confident. He believed he could defeat the coalition armies if he acted quickly before they fully united. His plan was bold. Two major enemy forces were gathering in Belgium, one led by the British commander Arthur Wellesley, now the Duke of Wellington, and the other led by the Prussian general Gebhard von Blücher. If Napoleon could strike these armies separately before they joined together, he might defeat them individually. It was a strategy similar to the one he had used many times before. In June 1815, Napoleon marched north with his army. The campaign that followed would decide his fate and bring the Napoleonic era to its final conclusion. The decisive battle would take place near a small village in Belgium called Waterloo, and there, Napoleon Bonaparte would face the final test of his extraordinary career. In the summer of 1815, Europe held its breath. Napoleon Bonaparte had returned from exile only months earlier, astonishing the world by reclaiming power in France without a single battle. His march from the southern coast to Paris had become legendary almost immediately. Soldiers sent to arrest him had joined him instead. Crowds had cheered his return. The king had fled. For a moment, it seemed as if history itself had reversed. But the great powers of Europe had no intention of allowing Napoleon to rebuild his empire again. The leaders of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia had already been meeting in Vienna to decide the future of Europe after his first abdication. News of his return shocked them, but it also united them. They declared Napoleon an outlaw. More importantly, they committed themselves to defeating him once and for all. Within weeks, armies began gathering along the borders of France. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were mobilized across the continent. Coalition leaders understood that Napoleon remained a dangerous opponent. If they moved slowly, he might defeat their armies one by one, as he had done many times before. Napoleon knew this as well. The moment he returned to power, he understood that time was his greatest enemy. The coalition armies were enormous, but they were scattered across Europe. If they all reached France at once, his chances of survival would vanish. But if he moved quickly, he might still defeat them individually. His strategy was daring but familiar. Strike first. Two major coalition armies were forming in Belgium, just north of France. One was commanded by the British general Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. The other was commanded by the Prussian Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. If these two armies joined forces, they would be extremely difficult to defeat. Napoleon decided to attack before that could happen. In June 1815, he assembled roughly 120,000 soldiers and marched north toward Belgium. His army was smaller than many he had commanded in the past, but it still contained experienced veterans alongside new recruits eager to prove themselves. The campaign began with speed. On June 15th, French forces crossed the border into Belgium, catching the coalition armies slightly off guard. Napoleon hoped to drive a wedge between Wellington and Blücher, forcing them to fight separately. The first major clash came on June 16th. Near the village of Ligny, Napoleon personally commanded French forces against the Prussian army led by Blücher. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Cannon fire shook the fields as infantry and cavalry clashed across farmland and small villages. By the end of the day, Napoleon achieved a victory. The Prussian army was forced to retreat, but it was not destroyed. Blücher managed to withdraw his troops in relatively good order, preserving the core of his army. Napoleon believed the Prussians were retreating eastward, away from Wellington's position. In reality, they moved north instead, planning to reconnect with the British army. Meanwhile, another battle occurred the same day at Quatre Bras, where French forces under Marshal Ney fought Wellington's troops. Ney's attacks were strong, but ultimately inconclusive, allowing Wellington to withdraw his army safely. Both sides now prepared for the decisive confrontation. Wellington chose his battlefield carefully. South of the small Belgian village of Waterloo, he positioned his army along a ridge overlooking open farmland. The terrain offered natural defensive advantages. Farms and buildings provided strong points where soldiers could hold their ground even against heavy attacks. Wellington's strategy was simple: defend the ridge and wait for the Prussians. If Blücher's army arrived in time, the combined forces could overwhelm Napoleon. On the morning of June 18th, 1815, the armies faced each other across the muddy fields near Waterloo. Heavy rain had fallen during the night, turning the ground soft and slippery. Napoleon decided to delay the attack for several hours to allow the soil to dry slightly, making it easier for artillery and cavalry to maneuver. The delay would prove significant. By midday, the battle began. Napoleon launched his first major assault against a farmhouse called Hougomont on Wellington's right flank. The building had been fortified by British and Allied troops, and it quickly became the center of intense fighting. French soldiers attacked repeatedly, yet the defenders held their ground stubbornly. What Napoleon had intended as a diversion turned into a prolonged struggle that consumed thousands of soldiers. Meanwhile, the main French attack advanced toward the center of Wellington's line. Infantry columns marched forward under heavy artillery fire. Muskets cracked across the battlefield as French troops pushed toward the ridge. For a time, it seemed possible that the attack might succeed, but Wellington's soldiers held firm. Hidden behind the crest of the ridge, they avoided much of the artillery fire and then rose suddenly to deliver devastating volleys at close range. French attacks faltered again and again. Napoleon ordered additional assaults throughout the afternoon. Cavalry charges thundered across the battlefield as thousands of mounted soldiers surged toward the British lines. But Wellington's troops formed defensive squares, tight formations of infantry bristling with bayonets that cavalry could not easily break. Again and again, the charges failed. Meanwhile, something far more dangerous was happening beyond Napoleon's view. Prussian forces were approaching the battlefield. Blücher had recovered from his defeat at Ligny and marched rapidly to support Wellington. By late afternoon, the first Prussian troops began arriving on Napoleon's right flank. The situation grew desperate. Napoleon now faced two armies instead of one. Still, he refused to accept defeat. In a final attempt to break Wellington's line before the Prussians could fully intervene, Napoleon ordered his elite Imperial Guard into battle. The Imperial Guard was the pride of the French army. These were veteran soldiers who had fought beside Napoleon for years. They were disciplined, experienced, and fiercely loyal. If anyone could break the enemy line, it was them. The Guard advanced slowly up the slope toward Wellington's position. For a moment, the battlefield seemed silent as the famous soldiers marched forward through smoke and mud. Then Wellington's troops rose from behind the ridge. A devastating volley of musket fire tore into the advancing Guard. The French soldiers attempted to continue forward, but the attack faltered. More volleys followed, and soon the Guard began to fall back. It was the first time the Imperial Guard had ever been repelled in battle. The effect on the French army was immediate and devastating. Word spread quickly across the battlefield. The Guard retreats. Panic followed. French formations began collapsing as coalition forces pressed forward. Prussian troops attacked from the flank, while Wellington's army advanced from the front. The French army disintegrated. Napoleon attempted to rally his soldiers, but the battle was lost. Night fell over the battlefield of Waterloo as the remnants of the French army retreated toward France. The defeat ended Napoleon's final attempt to reclaim power. 4 days later, he returned to Paris. Realizing that further resistance would only bring destruction to France, Napoleon abdicated the throne for the second time on June 22nd, 1815. This time, the coalition powers would not risk allowing him another chance to escape. Napoleon surrendered to the British and was placed aboard a warship. Instead of sending him to a nearby island like Elba, they chose a far more distant prison, St. Helena. The island lay in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, nearly 1,000 miles from the nearest continent. It was remote, isolated, and heavily guarded. There would be no return from St. Helena. Napoleon arrived there in October 1815. The island was bleak and windswept, a lonely place surrounded by endless ocean. The man who had once ruled much of Europe now lived under constant supervision in a modest house called Longwood. During his years on the island, Napoleon spent much of his time reflecting on his life. He dictated memoirs to companions who had followed him into exile, describing his campaigns, his decisions, and his vision for France. These writings helped shape the legend that would grow around his name. Even in defeat, Napoleon understood the power of history. He died on May 5th, 1821, at the age of 51. News of his death spread across Europe and beyond. To some, he remained a tyrant who had plunged the continent into years of war. To others, he was a brilliant leader who had transformed society and carried the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. But to history, Napoleon Bonaparte would always remain something extraordinary. A young Corsican officer who rose through revolution and war to become emperor. A commander whose victories reshaped the map of Europe, and a figure whose story continues to fascinate the world more than 2 centuries later. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. The life of Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most remarkable journeys in history. A boy born on a small island in the Mediterranean would rise through revolution, command enormous armies, reshape the map of Europe, crown himself emperor, and leave a legacy that historians still debate more than 2 centuries later. From the mountains of Italy to the deserts of Egypt, from the glittering halls of Paris to the frozen roads of Russia, his story carried both extraordinary triumph and devastating defeat. And yet, even after his empire collapsed, when he was sent into exile on a distant island in the Atlantic, the name Napoleon never truly disappeared. His ideas about leadership, law, government, and warfare continued shaping the modern world long after the cannons of his wars had fallen silent. History is filled with powerful figures, but very few have left a mark as large, as complicated, or as enduring as his. As the winds moved across the remote island of St. Helena in 1821, the man who had once commanded much of Europe took his final breath. But the legend of Napoleon Bonaparte had already passed beyond the boundaries of time, and in many ways, it still lives on today. Before you drift off tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel, and I read as many of your comments as I can. And if you enjoy slow, immersive historical stories like this one, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next journey into the past. For now, thank you for spending this quiet time here. Take a deep breath, relax, and let the story fade gently into the night. Good night.